A lonely little Pokémon in the dark. Close your eyes and let your mind wander. Tonight we're drifting into a different corner of the Pokémon world. Not through gyms or championships, but through a single, quiet story that lingers in the dim light of memory. Imagine it is late at night, your room held in that soft, bluish glow from a screen, the rest of the house already asleep. The opening chime of an old game hums in the air, thin and a little distant, like something remembered from long ago. On the screen, Kanto unfolds again, not as a map to conquer, but as a dream you have wandered through many times before. Lavender Town's pale colors, the tiny houses, the tower reaching up into a sky that always feels just a little colder than the roots around it. The music is simple, almost fragile, a few 8-bit notes repeating in a pattern that somehow makes the room feel emptier and fuller at the same time. In that space between sound and silence, one small figure waits, Cubone, a tiny ground type described in the Pokédex again and again as the lonely Pokémon. Its body is small, almost childlike, its limbs a little stubby, its tail barely lifting behind it as it walks. In its hands, an oversized bone that looks too heavy for such a slight frame, and on its head, always, that smooth, white skull. It tilts its gaze toward the moon, the eye sockets of its helmet turned upward, as if searching for something in the pale light that never quite answers back. Cubone cries its sobs muffled by bone. Cubone cries its sobs muffled by bone, its tears soaking into the skull until the surface is stained. It is one of the simplest stories in Pokémon, written in a handful of words, and yet it feels heavier than many legends of gods and dragons. Everyone knows how the story goes. Cubone's mother is a Marowak. Lavender Town's tower holds her restless spirit. Team Rocket is punished, and the ghost is finally at peace. But if you look carefully at the Pokédex entries across regions and across time, the details shift like shadows on a wall. The text speaks of a dead mother, of a skull, of grief that never quite fades. But it almost never tells you clearly what species that mother truly was. There is a gentle unease in that silence, a small imbalance in the myth. You return to Pokémon for cozy nostalgia, for nature and adventure in miniature. Yet here, at the edge of sleep, you find a child wearing a parent's remains. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing one lonely Pokémon's path through memory, mourning, and the way games meant for children sometimes whisper about loss. In this story, we will move slowly. We will walk through Pokédex entries from ancient cartridges to modern screens, climb the quiet floors of Lavender Town's tower, listen to fan theories that try to name the hidden parent under that skull, and look for the emotional thread that ties them all together. To this day, many players accept the Marowak answer without question, but the text itself hints at something stranger, something more haunting, and perhaps more human than that simple explanation. So, close your eyes and let your mind wander back to that small town of chimes and mist. Picture the silhouette of a Cubone at the edge of the tower, skull tilted to the moon, bone clutched close like a keepsake. The world around you grows quiet, the glow of the screen softens and the story begins to open. What if Cubone's tragic origin was never really about a Marowak at all? Drifting back to Lavender Town. Tonight, we're drifting into a place you already half remember, a town made not of pixels and code, but of a feeling that never quite left you. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to Kanto, back to that first journey along the coast, when the music of the world suddenly changed. One moment, bright and adventurous, the next, a thin, wavering melody, like wind moving through an empty room. Lavender Town appears on the screen in muted purples and soft greys, and at once you understand, even as a child, that this town is different. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer pausing at the edge of something quiet and strange. The houses are small, pressed close together as if for comfort, their windows glowing with a gentle light. NPCs move slowly here, and when you speak to them, their words are hushed, full of spirits and loss and the weight of names remembered. There is a Pokémon Center, a mart, the usual shapes of a familiar game, but they feel secondary, like polite necessities standing in the shadow of something older. Above it all, the Pokémon Tower rises tall and narrow like a dark candle set in the middle of town. Floor upon floor of graves and memorials, chimes and incense, a place where time seems to thin out into a pale fog. In most cities, the tallest building is a gym, a monument to strength and progress. Here, the central landmark is a graveyard, a monument to endings to the stories that have already slipped beyond your reach. For a children's game, it is a strange choice, almost an ancient one, a whole town built around mourning, and yet it never feels cruel, not to punish, but to reset your sense of what this world can hold. You climb the tower, not simply to test yourself, but to walk through a space where grief is acknowledged, where the restless spirits of Pokémon drift in and out of view. It is here, among the tombstones and the chanting channelers, that Cubone steps quietly into the foreground of the story. Wild Cubone appear in the tower, small and alone, their bone clubs clutched tight. NPCs speak of a Cubone whose mother was killed by Team Rocket, and of a ghost that still lingers, blocking the way. You meet that ghost, the spirit of a Marowak, and you help it find peace, but the game is careful. It never says that every Cubone's mother is a Marowak. It never claims that this one story explains them all. To this day, many people remember Lavender Town as the first time they realized games could be sad, that a quiet melody and a few lines of text could stay with you long after the console clicked off. Lavender Town becomes a kind of dream space, where the border between game mechanics and emotion grows thin, where catching a Pokémon and comforting a lonely creature feel almost the same. In that liminal space, questions begin to form. If Cubone always wears its mother's skull, and if that skull can differ from one individual to another, then what species is being mourned beneath that mask of bone? The tower gives you one specific ghost in one specific place, but the world hints at something broader, something the story only whispers. Before we follow those whispers into theories and hidden meanings, we need to listen to the one voice that has been speaking about Cubone from the very beginning. The Pokédex has been telling this story generation by generation in fragments and variations. In the next part of our journey, we'll move gently through those entries, tracing how Cubone's myth has changed with time and what its own lore suggests about the mother behind the mask. What the Pokédex really says about Cubone. So now, as the Pokédex begins to speak, you can almost imagine it as a quiet storybook left open at your bedside, each entry a tiny paragraph whispered in the dark. Not a scientific report with measurements and charts, but a collection of short, vivid lines written by different hands over time, all trying to describe the same small, grieving shape. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can hear those voices overlapping softly. Let's begin at the very beginning in Kanto, where the first Pokédex entries give Cubone the outline of its myth. In Red and Blue, the words are simple and strangely heavy. Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother. When it remembers her, it cries, and its tears stain the bone. In Yellow, that image is repeated and deepened, like a lullaby verse sung again. The same skull, the same crying, the same marks left behind, as if time itself were etching grief into the mask. From there, the story spreads outward through later generations, but the core never really changes. Again and again, the Pokédex returns to the same motifs. Cubone is lonely, it mourns, it stares up at the moon as if searching the sky for someone it has lost. In this gentle, fictional world, its true face is almost less important than the idea that it is hidden, tucked away behind bone and memory. The skull is not just protection, it is a curtain drawn over a wound. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, the details become more specific, almost like a storyteller leaning closer to the candlelight. Those entries tell you that Cubone cries at night, that its sobs echo in a way that unsettles those who hear them. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the skull is described as too large for its small body, a weight it carries everywhere, the sound of its quiet lament, drifting out from beneath the bone. The world keeps moving, but Cubone remains there, a child wrapped in an heirloom it never chose. As the Pokédex evolves, some entries drift away from biological explanation and linger instead on feeling. They talk about Cubone trying to be brave, gripping its bone club like a comfort object, as if holding on to the last piece of its family. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, a tiny creature learning to walk through nature with grief as its shadow. To this day, the most enduring facts recorded about Cubone are not about its height or its habitat, but about its sadness. And yet, for all this focus on the mother, notice what the Pokédex gently refuses to say. It never shows you Cubone before the skull. It never clearly describes the living form of that mother, never offers a general, unambiguous species name. The skull is always its mother's, but the mother herself remains just out of frame, an absence described only by what she left behind. In Alola and beyond, from generations 7 through 9, the tone shifts slightly, as if the storytellers have grown older and kinder. Some entries speak more of Cubone's resilience, of cultures that teach it to channel sorrow through the bone it carries, not to punish, but to reset the balance inside its small heart. The dead mother motif remains, but it is wrapped now in rituals, in hints of communities that understand grief as part of the world's quiet rhythm. Tonight we're drifting into something that feels less like a clean encyclopedia and more like folklore, a myth, told and retold across regions and time. Different professors, different travelers, all watching the same Pokémon and reaching for meaning in its tears. And if the Pokédex itself is a collection of legends, then perhaps the story you have always heard about Cubone's mother is also a kind of myth, one that beneath its familiar surface may be hiding a stranger truth about who or what once wore that skull first. Genesis 1's Haunting. Words, the original Cubone lore. To this day, those lines from the very first games feel different from almost anything else in the Pokédex. In Red and Blue, Cubone is described in words you might remember almost by heart. It wears the skull of its deceased mother, and cries when it remembers its mother, its tears staining the skull it wears. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can almost see that single, small figure alone against the wide Kanto sky. In a world mostly described in terms of types and moves and habitats, this was something quieter and stranger. The Pokédex did not talk about strength or power here, but about memory and grief. Where's the skull of its deceased mother is a simple sentence, but in the gentle, pixelated space of a 1990s handheld screen, it landed like a story half told. It did not explain, it simply stated, as if this were a natural part of nature, accepted and ancient. There is something haunting in the way the entry slows down around the image of tears on bone. You are invited to imagine a childlike creature clutching a club in one hand and, on its head, a literal piece of its parent, serving as armor and comfort at the same time. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, pausing on a quiet route and wondering what kind of love and what kind of loss would make a little Pokémon carry its mother with it everywhere it goes. Yet even here, at what feels like the beginning of Cubone's myth, there are gaps. The text never tells you how Cubone receives the skull, or whether every Cubone has known this same sorrow. It does not say what species the mother is, only that she is gone, leaving behind this pale mask. In the stillness between those words, your mind begins to wander, filling the empty space with possibilities the game never confirms. Yellow version adds another layer, as if the story is being retold by a different traveler. Now Cubone's nightly crying is emphasized, its sobs echoing when the world is otherwise asleep, and you are told that no one has ever seen its real face. The focus shifts from the mother to the child's hidden identity, deepening the sense that something essential is always just out of sight, concealed behind bone and tears. Tonight, we're drifting into the way those early entries quietly asked you to participate. Were you reading about a universal law of the species, or about one particular Cubone whose grief happened to be recorded? Was the skull meant as a literal biological fact, or as a symbol the game never dared to decode aloud? A single sentence became an entire myth, unfolding in your thoughts long after you closed the Game Boy. In that way, Generation 1 planted a seed, a small story about loss and remembrance, left deliberately unfinished so that players across time could grow their own versions of what really happened. And to understand why so many of those stories eventually circled back to one specific mother, we have to leave the Pokédex for a moment and climb the quiet, haunted floors of Pokémon Tower, where a lone Cubone waits beneath the shadow of a Marowak's ghost. The ghost in the tower, Marowak's final stand. And so you climb. The sounds of Lavender Town fall away behind you as you step into the tower's first floor, that quiet sanctuary of stone and incense. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, and you can almost hear it. The soft chime of memorial bells, the low murmur of channelers offering prayers to Pokémon whose names have faded with time. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer moving through a place built for remembrance, not for glory. As you ascend, the air grows colder, and the mood of the tower shifts. The channelers you meet are not calm caretakers, but people overcome by something they cannot fully grasp. Their eyes are wide, their voices strange, and they speak in broken phrases about spirits and possession. Around them, Ghastly and Haunter drift through the dim space like living fog, reminders that in this world, the line between body and spirit is not always firm. Each encounter feels less like a challenge and more like stepping deeper into an old myth about restless souls. Higher still, the staircase suddenly stops being a path and becomes a barrier. An unidentifiable ghost blocks your way, its form distorted, its presence heavy. The game does not name it yet. It is simply the ghost, a shape that cannot be touched, cannot be calmed, and cannot be passed. Your usual tools of balance and partnership fail here. You are told, very gently, that you need something more. When you return with the Sylph Scope, the moment is almost ceremonial. You stand before the same ghost, but now you carry a device that reveals what the human eye alone cannot see. The screen flashes, the distortion clears, and the truth appears. A Marowak, towering and solemn, its sprite framed by the quiet of the tower. The text does not leave room for doubt. This is the spirit of a Cubone's mother, killed by Team Rocket. One Cubone, one Marowak, one act of cruelty that has left an echo in this single place. To this day, many players remember that revelation as if it were a universal rule, as though the game had whispered, every Cubone's mother is a Marowak. But the story is smaller, more personal. The script speaks of this Cubone, this mother, this lingering sorrow. It never declares a law of nature for the entire species. It simply offers a quiet tragedy in a tower of graves. When you finally calm Marowak's spirit, the game's tone softens even further. There is no triumphant fanfare, only a simple line. Her soul has been freed, and she departs to the afterlife, leaving Cubone behind. The world feels still for a moment, as if the tower itself is exhaling. Tonight, we're drifting into that feeling of gentle completion, the sense that you have done something kind, not to punish, but to reset a tiny corner of the world's grief. Over time, children playing in dimly lit rooms blurred this specific story into a grander assumption. If this Cubone's mother was a Marowak, then surely all Cubone must be orphaned Marowak children, their skulls a single, shared inheritance. In ancient times, storytellers would take a local legend and let it grow until it covered the whole sky. Players did the same with this quiet ghost. Yet when you step back from the tower and look across the wider canon, a different picture begins to emerge. The Pokédex speaks of its mother, but rarely names her species. Other regions add layers of ritual and culture to Cubone's grief that do not quite fit the simple Lavender Town tale. And there, in the space between one confirmed Marowak and countless unnamed mothers, the mystery deepens, and the story of Cubone's true origin starts to change in ways the tower never told you. One story versus every story. Is Marowak really the rule? From that small gap between one named Marowak and many unnamed mothers, a quieter question begins to form. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and notice how the Lavender Town story is told. The game does not say, every Cubone's mother is a Marowak. It tells you about one spirit in one tower, in one haunted corner of the world, unable to move on because of what humans have done. In that story, the ghost is clearly called Marowak. The town mourns her. The old man in the house beside the tower speaks of a single Cubone left behind. It is framed as a particular tragedy, an exception that disturbed the balance of that quiet place, not as a calm entry in a biological encyclopedia. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer listening to a myth whispered through flickering Game Boy pixels. When you step away from Lavender and look at the Pokédex across regions and time, the language shifts into something almost like a bedtime story. It wears the skull of its deceased mother. It cries at night for its mother whose skull it wears. Always its mother in the singular, as if the game is telling you a tale about a child and a loss, not a chart of breeding pairs and inheritance. To this day, there is no quiet line that says Cubone is born from Marowak, or Cubone evolves from the offspring of Marowak. The space where that mechanical sentence might go is left empty. In most evolution lines, the games are very direct. Pichu becomes Pikachu, then Raichu. Magikarp becomes Gyarados. Arrows, levels, methods, all carefully laid out. Parent and child, by contrast, are rare in this world, and often softened into symbols. Kangaskhan is shown with a baby, but the nature of that baby is never fully explained. It is more image than manual, more myth than diagram, so it becomes possible, gently, to imagine that Cubone's broader origin is meant to remain a little hazy. Lavender Town offers you a specific name, Marowak, and a specific wrong that needed to be set right, not to punish, but to reset the tower's peace. At the same time, the Pokédex speaks in archetypes, a child, a skull, a grief that echoes through time and space. Players, especially when they are young, do something very human with that mixture. They smooth it out. One Cubone with one Marowak in one ancient-feeling town quietly becomes the rule for every Cubone everywhere. It is easier on a sleepy mind to hold a single, simple sentence than a tangle of exceptions and quiet maybes. Later games return to Lavender's story with great care. In Fire Red and Leaf Green in Let's Go, Pikachu and Eevee, the same Marowak spirit rises, recognizes kindness, and finally rests. The tale is lovingly retold but never expanded into a universal lore. No entry steps forward to declare all Cubone mothers are Marowak now. Tonight we're drifting into the place where that difference matters, the soft border between what the text actually shows you and what your memory has woven around it. The border is where fan theories, headcanons, and gentle urban legends take root. We are not here to scold your childhood understanding, only to set it beside the canon and see both clearly. And from here, with the official story traced in quiet lines, we can step into the foggier realm of speculation, beginning with the most famous and controversial Cubone theory of them all. Whispers of a different mother. Enter the Kangaskhan theory, and from here, with the official story traced in quiet lines, we can step into the foggier realm of speculation, beginning with the most famous and controversial Cubone theory of them all. For many players, even as children, there was a gentle, nagging feeling that something about Cubone did not quite rest in balance, as if its story leaned toward Marowak on paper, yet its shape and sorrow were whispering about someone else. Close your eyes and let your mind wander just for a moment to that small, hunched figure. The skull is too large, the tail a little thick, the posture strangely familiar if you have ever looked closely at another Pokémon, Kangaskhan. Out of that quiet resemblance grew a theory, almost a myth, that Cubone is not a baby Marowak at all, but an orphaned Kangaskhan child wearing the skull of its fallen mother and learning to walk alone in a world that suddenly feels too wide. In ancient times of the early internet, long before sleek social media feeds, this idea passed from playground to playground, from message board to message board, like a secret bedtime story. People pointed to the baby that always rests in Kangaskhan's pouch, to the rounded snout and thick tail, to the way both mother and child seem built for holding and being held. They noticed that Cubone's body, stripped of its skull, could almost be that baby, grown just a little older, still clinging to a piece of its protector. Tonight, we're drifting into those old rumors that Cubone, Marowak, and Kangaskhan were once a single evolution line, split apart late in development. Some claimed that a baby Kangaskhan was meant to become Cubone if its mother died, and then grow into Marowak, while a safely raised child would remain a full Kangaskhan. There was no clear proof in the games themselves, only suggestive sprites and half-remembered comments, but that uncertainty made the theory feel like a hidden truth quietly removed, not to punish, but to reset the story into something simpler. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, listening to fan-made myths echo against official lore. To this day, the Kangaskhan theory feels less like a hard claim and more like modern folklore, a gentle tale fans told each other to make sense of Cubone's endless tears and Kangaskhan's perpetual motherhood. Rather than numbers and data, it trades in images: a pouch, now empty, a skull, now worn, a child learning to survive by turning grief into armor. The emotional center shifts too. Instead of a neat parent-child line, Cubone Marowak, we are invited to imagine a tiny baby losing a towering, sheltering figure, a living fortress of fur and scale. The tragedy becomes larger, the space around that loss more echoing and cold. And yet, as soothing as this story can be in its own melancholic way, the actual Pokédex entries and game data do not sit with it easily. In the next quiet stretch, we will follow those tensions and see what they reveal about how Game Freak writes tragedy. For now, close your eyes and let your mind wander to a Kangaskhan falling, its child left alone with nothing but a skull to remember it by. And ask yourself, very softly, whether the games themselves ever truly show this scene, or if it only lives in the dreams of players. Picking apart the Kangaskhan connection. In that imagined scene, you can almost see the dust settling in the quiet air of Lavender Town, the world holding its breath around a tiny, grieving shape. Close your eyes and let your mind wander there for just a moment longer, because the Kangaskhan theory grows out of that same stillness, out of the wish to give that child a familiar face. It is comforting in its way to picture Cubone as a baby Kangaskhan simply misplaced. The theory has such an emotional pull because it offers something the games never quite show you, a clear, concrete image of Cubone without its skull. Players notice the similar body proportions, the rounded snout, the sturdy little tail, and they think of the baby that always peeks from Kangaskhan's pouch. They remember old rumors of unused or beta evolution lines, whispers that Cubone was once meant to grow into Kangaskhan, and they trace the curve of the skull, saying that it looks so much like Kangaskhan's head turned to bone. It feels like a myth that explains everything in a single, satisfying shape. But when you turn from that dream to the quiet numbers inside the games, the world looks different. In the data, Cubone and Kangaskhan are separate species with no hidden evolution link, no secret method that lets one become the other. Their egg groups do not match, their habitats and behaviors in the Pokédex belong to different corners of nature, different lives. To this day, no entry for Cubone, Marowak or Kangaskhan ever pauses to suggest a shared origin, even in later generations where Game Freak sometimes smiles at fan theories or nods to jokes the community has carried through time. Breeding, too, gently unravels the idea. When you pair Kangaskhan in the daycare, the egg that appears does not hatch into Cubone, no matter how patiently you walk, no matter how carefully you keep your steps in balance. Kangaskhan always arrives with a baby already in her pouch, as if the line itself refuses to be separated, while Cubone hatches alone, skull and sorrow implied, but never explicitly tied to that towering parent. Tonight, we're drifting into a softer understanding of what this all means. The persistence of the Kangaskhan story may say less about secret developer intent and more about the way players lean toward closure, especially around grief. Fan theories become modern myths, gentle stories we tell to smooth over ambiguity, to give shape to loss, to make a tragic design feel complete enough that we can sleep. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, wandering through half-lit corridors of data and memory. And in that half-light, the Kangaskhan theory, likely non-canon in any strict sense, still matters deeply. It has become part of Cubone's cultural story, proof of how strongly its quiet sadness echoed through the space between player and game. Yet if Cubone is not secretly a Kangaskhan baby, and if Lavender's Marowak explains only one ghost in one tower, a gentle question lingers in the dark. What then is Cubone really? And where do all those skulls truly come from? The baby Marowak idea, a simpler, sadder cycle. In that quiet uncertainty, many players gently reach for the simplest answer. If Cubone grows into Marowak, then perhaps Cubone is, in its heart, just a baby Marowak whose mother has died. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can almost see the line: small, trembling child, then hardened adult, all within a single, sorrowful family. This reading feels very natural because it follows the ordinary rhythm of the Pokémon world. Basic form to evolution, child to adult, one stage learning, the next stage surviving. The only difference is that for Cubone, the story seems to begin after a loss. The Pokédex quietly reinforces this. It tells you of a tiny creature that cries at night, clutching the skull of its mother, its tears staining the bone, its loneliness echoing across time and space. Then when you look at Marowak's entries, you see an answer of sorts. Marowak is described as stoic, as used to hardship, as one that has overcome sorrow and become tougher. Where Cubone hides under a skull for comfort, Marowak wields bone as a weapon and as a symbol, standing upright in a world that once felt too large. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer trying to grow up without forgetting. From there, some fans imagine a quiet, implied cycle. A Cubone's mother, they say, was once a Cubone herself, who also lost her mother and wore her skull and learned to move through grief until she evolved. When she eventually passed away, her child inherited that same skull, the same pale mask touched by many tears. In this gentle myth, every skull is not just bone, but memory, carrying an ancient lineage of mourning. To this day, the games never truly confirm this. They never describe Marowak giving birth to Cubone, never explain how a skull is passed down, never tell you whether each one is unique or part of a family line. The stories are suggestive, not complete, as if leaving a little space for your own imagination to rest in. There is a heavy tenderness to this imagined cycle, a species defined by inherited grief where every child begins life already in mourning. It resonates with something very human, the way sadness, fear, or silence can move quietly from one generation to the next, not to punish, but to reset the way a family understands the world. In ancient times, people told myths to explain why sorrow seemed to run in certain bloodlines. Here, the myth wears a small white skull, and yet if every Cubone needs a dead mother's skull, where did the first one come from? Are there Cubone whose mothers survive, whose skulls are never claimed? The text leaves these questions open like a door half ajar. Tonight we're drifting into a softer answer. Perhaps Cubone is less a biological puzzle and more an archetype, the orphan, the mourner, the child learning to stand in a world where nature sometimes takes parents away, and where memory becomes its own kind of armor. An orphan of any species? The broadest theory. If Cubone is an archetype, then its skull might not belong to any one lineage at all. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine a quieter, stranger possibility. That Cubone is what happens in this world whenever a very small Pokémon loses its mother, no matter the species, and clings to the last thing it can carry. In this telling, there is no single pre-evolution hiding under the bone. There is only a child, once a Rattata or a Sandshrew or even a tiny Eevee, who wakes up in a world that has shifted out of balance and finds her mother's skull in the grass. The Pokédex, to this day, almost never says it's Marowak mother. It only ever whispers its mother, as if the details of species and biology are less important than the simple, aching shape of the loss. You may notice how carefully the games avoid showing what Cubone looks like before the skull. There is no official artwork of a bare-headed form, no ancient sprite tucked away that reveals a familiar face. Instead, the design begins with the mask already in place, as though the story of Cubone starts at the moment of grief, not at the moment of birth. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing the outline of a myth rather than a family tree. In that gentle, folkloric light, Cubone becomes less a creature and more a form. Grief takes in the Pokémon world. It is a universal stand-in for bereaved children, the way a ghost story might speak about a wandering spirit rather than a named person. A Cubone is what you are when you are small, alone, and trying to carry memory as armor, no matter whether you once had fur like an Eevee or scales like a trapinch. Tonight, we're drifting into a version of the story where that idea explains little details the games only hint at. Artists sometimes draw Cubone with skulls of slightly different shapes and sizes, horns a bit longer here, eye sockets a bit wider there, as though each one comes from a different mother, a different species, a different quiet tragedy. Official media does not emphasize this, but it does not quite close the door on it either, leaving space for your imagination to wander. Of course, this stretches beyond strict canon. The games still treat Cubone as a normal species. It hatches from eggs, it evolves into Marowak, it sits neatly in the Pokédex with a number and a height and a weight. Pokémon has always blended nature with myth, though, especially in ghostly entries where mountains remember, forests curse, and legends act not to punish but to reset. If you see Cubone as an archetype of loss rather than a single creature, its tragedy softens and widens. It is no longer just one family line marked by sorrow, but the quiet acknowledgement that grief exists even in this bright world of color and companionship. And to understand how far this idea might reach, we have to step, just for a moment, outside the world of the story and look at how Cubone was drawn, written, and shaped by its creators. Behind the skull, Cubone's design and early sprites. So for a little while, we'll step away from theories and family trees and simply look. Not at Cubone as a character in a myth, but as a drawing, as a cluster of pixels that someone once placed with great care on a tiny green screen. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, as if you're thumbing through an ancient sketchbook, its pages filled with early Game Freak concepts. Tonight, we're drifting into that quiet space between creator and creature, where a lonely idea becomes a shape, and a shape becomes a story. In Red and Green's original sprite, Cubone is so small that the skull almost seems to swallow it. The head tilts slightly forward, as if weighed down, the empty eye sockets turn just off to the side. You can see one eye peeking through, but the rest of its true face disappears beneath bone. Its body is partly obscured, wrapped around the skull's outline, as though its whole identity has been pulled inward and hidden away. The posture is subtly hunched, shoulders gathered, one arm gripping the bone club close to its chest. There is no wide stance, no grand gesture of power. Instead, there is a quiet, guarded readiness, a sense that this small creature is trying to be brave in a world that feels too large. Even without a single line of text, the mood is there. When you compare regional releases, the differences are gentle but meaningful. In the Japanese Red and Green sprite, the shading is harsher, the skull darker, the outlines a little rougher, giving Cubone a more severe, almost gaunt presence. In the later Red and Blue version, and then in Yellow, the pose softens, the curves round out, and the tilt of the head feels just a little cuter, a little less burdened. Over time, remakes like Fire Red and Leaf Green smooth the shadows even further, brightening the skull, widening the visible eye, as if the design itself is slowly guiding Cubone away from pure sorrow towards something more balanced. This decision to never show its true face is one of the most powerful choices in the entire design. The skull is not only armor, it is a mask, a permanent costume that turns grief into a silhouette. To this day, you cannot say where Cubone ends and the relic of its mother begins. Its entire presence is defined by absence. It is easy to imagine the designers starting not with a species, but with a feeling, a lonely Pokémon, a child of loss, wrapped in nature's remnants, like improvised armor. From there, the bone club, the thick tail, and the hardened stance of Marowak form a thematic pair. Youth and adulthood, mourning and resolve, two stages of the same quiet myth. Early concept art from that era is scarce, and much of Gen 1's development lives only in memory. Yet what we do see of Cubone and Marowak suggests a deliberate pairing, their shapes echoing each other in skull, club, and that slightly stooped, wary posture. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, reading emotion in a few dozen pixels. On that small Game Boy screen, Cubone's hunched back and careful grip told you everything. It was hurt, but still standing. And if the sprite alone could carry that much feeling, the words that accompanied it, the Pokédex's quiet, tragic flavor text, would deepen the story even further and hint at why Cubone's legend was meant to linger in your thoughts long after you closed the game. How Game Freak writes tragedy into the Pokédex. The Pokédex, for all its bright colors and simple menus, has always had a surprisingly somber streak. You open it expecting measurements and habitat notes, and instead you find, slipped between the lines, quiet little tragedies and ghost stories that seem almost amused by how dark they are allowed to be. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to Sinnoh's fields, where Drifloon is described as gently taking a child's hand and, if the wind is right, drifting away with them into the open sky. Think of Unova's Yamask carrying a mask that looks like its own human face, sometimes weeping softly as it remembers a life it can never return to. Or Phantump, in Kalos, said to be formed from the spirit of a child lost in the forest, now echoing through the wooden body of a tiny tree. These are not long tales. They are a sentence here, a phrase there, like a single whispered line at the edge of sleep. Tonight, we're drifting into the idea that many Pokédex entries are less like encyclopedia notes and more like miniature horror or tragedy vignettes, each one adding depth and contrast to a design that might otherwise be only cute or only simple on the surface. In that world of gentle unease, Cubone stands as one of the earliest and clearest examples of Game Freak's approach. A small, hunched creature with a club and a skull, introduced in the very first generation, whose entire identity is wrapped around a single, heavy sentence. It wears the skull of its dead mother and cries when it remembers her. To this day, that one idea defines it more strongly than its type, its moves, or its strength. Game Freak seems to understand that you are not just playing for excitement and triumph. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, wandering through tall grass and quiet towns, meeting stories that carry different emotional textures. Some Pokémon are about courage, some about mischief, and some, like Cubone, are about a kind of soft, lingering melancholy that asks you to pause and feel. Over time, later generations have gently adjusted these darker entries, not to erase them, but to frame them with a little more light. Alolan Marowak, for example, turns mourning into ritual, channeling its grief into ghostly flames and communal dances, as if the culture of Pokémon itself has learned to honor the dead in a way that emphasizes resilience and shared memory rather than only loss. In ancient times, human stories for children often carried similar themes. Tales of spirits, of partings, of journeys to other worlds were told not to punish, but to reset a child's sense of balance, to show that sadness can exist alongside joy, that the world can be kind and mysterious at the same time. The Pokédex feels like a continuation of that tradition. You can imagine it as a collection of campfire stories told by different trainers across regions, each entry a voice in the dark. Some exaggerate, some soften, and some, like Cubone's, sound almost too honest, as though someone decided to whisper an uncomfortable truth into a game about adventure. And so, whatever the exact biology under that skull may be, Cubone's origin was always meant to be more than a mechanic. It is a mirror held up to grief itself, a reminder that even in a world of bright pixels and gentle nature, loss has a place, and that how we tell its story matters as much as what species exactly is hiding underneath. The Cubone's story hurts so much, and that mirror does something very simple and very powerful. It asks you to remember the first time you read Cubone's Pokédex entry, or the first time someone mentioned Lavender Town to you, and you felt that small, unexpected jolt of sadness in the middle of an otherwise light-hearted journey. The world of Kanto is bright and simple, and then, quietly, there is this child, alone, wearing loss on its head. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, back to that feeling. You may not have fully understood the words about its dead mother, or the way the music in that tower seemed to slow down time and space around you, but something in you recognized the shape of that story. Even if you had never known a loss like that, you could feel that Cubone was carrying something heavy, something that did not quite fit inside such a small frame. Cubone's grief is a very specific kind of grief, the grief of a child who has lost a parent. It is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, stubborn, and strangely brave. It picks up the nearest thing that feels solid, a skull that should have been too heavy, and puts it on like armor. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer trying to move forward by literally wearing a memory, as if staying close to what is gone might keep the world in balance. In ancient times, storytellers wrapped this same ache in different clothes. Fairy tales with orphaned heroes, animated films where parents vanish in the first moments, legends where loss becomes the doorway to adventure. Cubone stands in that long, ancient line of children in stories who lose someone, and in losing them begin to see the world with deeper empathy. Not to punish, but to reset the way a heart understands kindness. Its design turns all of that inward feeling outward. The skull is mourning made physical. The bone club is both a tool and a relic, something to lean on and something to swing when the world feels too large. The Pokédex says its cries echo inside the skull and make a sad melody, and to this day you can almost hear that imagined sound when you picture it. The tears never quite stop, they just dry a little faster each time. Many players, especially as children, did not sit and analyze any of this. They simply felt it. They saw Cubone and, without knowing why, wanted to catch it, to keep it safe, to walk with it far away from that tower. Some projected their own losses onto it, some only a vague protectiveness, but the connection formed all the same, a quiet thread between screen and sleeper. Tonight, we're drifting into that shared space where a tiny sprite can hold such big feelings. This is not about diagnosing anyone's grief or turning Cubone into a lesson. It is about noticing how much room there is inside a small myth. Because the games never fully explain every detail, whose skull, which mother, what happened before, there is space for you to fill the gaps with your own gentle stories. And as the series moved on and new regions and new myths unfolded, Game Freak seemed to understand how deeply this little orphan had settled into players' hearts, and they began, very softly, to either ease that sorrow or deepen it, letting Cubone's tragedy evolve along with the world around it. Later generations softening and deepening the loss. As the generations pass, you can almost feel the developers placing a gentler hand on Cubone's shoulder, not erasing the sorrow, but changing the way the story is told. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine those familiar Pokédex screens slowly shifting, line by line, as if the world itself is learning how to speak about grief. In the earliest days, the entries are stark. The skull of its dead mother, the tears that never quite stop, the way it cries at the moon. But later descriptions begin to lean toward motion rather than paralysis. In some regions, you are told that Cubone trains by swinging its bone, that it practices every day, that it is stubborn and hardy. The focus drifts from the weight of the skull to the way those small arms refuse to put the bone down, as if the memory has turned into a tool and then into a companion. To this day, many entries still mention its sadness, but they start to describe what it does with that sadness. One Pokédex notes that it grows stronger as it remembers its mother. Another suggests that it is trying to become like the parent it lost, mimicking motions it once watched in quiet awe. The story is no longer only about a child crushed by absence. It becomes a myth about a child who keeps moving, who finds a strange, fragile balance between mourning and becoming. Tonight, we're drifting into the way the wider Cubone line is reframed as well. When you arrive in Alola, Marowak is no longer just a ground-type guardian of a lonely tower. It appears in a new spectral form, dancing with ghostly blue-green flames, twirling its bone like a ceremonial staff. Its Pokédex entries speak of it as a fire dancer that honors spirits, moving in patterns passed down through generations, not to punish, but to reset the relationship between the living and the dead into something almost celebratory. In that warm island light, Cubone is no longer simply an orphan in the dark. It is the child of a culture that has rituals for sorrow. Those flames, those dances, suggest that somewhere, in ancient times, a community of Cubone and Marowak learned to live with loss by turning it into ceremony. Grief becomes choreography, memory becomes a shared language, and the lonely skull becomes part of a quiet, ongoing tradition. You can sense, very softly, that Game Freak is acknowledging the heaviness of the original concept. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, watching a small creature move from solitary mourning towards something like belonging. Yet the core remains untouched. The mother is still gone. The skull is still there. The tears are still mentioned. The language grows warmer, but the absence at the center of the myth is never quite filled in. And even as the lore expands, the biological questions stay carefully unanswered. The species of the mother is rarely named, the shape of the skull is said to differ, and no entry ever quite tells you what came before. It is as if the story itself is inviting you to stand at the edge of that mystery. Because now, wrapped in rituals, dances, and quiet resilience, we are finally ready to ask the question that has been waiting under the bone all along. If it was never truly a Marowak, then what exactly is Cubone's tragic origin pointing us toward? Framing the mystery. What we know and what we don't. So before we drift any deeper, let's lay everything out on the table for a moment, the way you might spread puzzle pieces in a quiet room. To this day, the one thing the games never hesitate to tell you is simple and stark. Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother. It holds that skull, it presses it close, and at night it cries, its small voice echoing into the dark. In Kanto, this sorrow brushes against Lavender Town, where one specific Marowak dies and lingers as a ghost, and where Cubone, if it endures long enough, will itself evolve into Marowak. Those are the bones of the canon, if you like. Around them, the world has grown gentle layers of interpretation. One story, the most straightforward, says that every Cubone's mother must have been a Marowak, and that the skull is simply the natural inheritance of a species line. Another, more whispered, is the Kangaskhan theory, imagining Cubone as a joey whose mother fell before it could grow, the skull a remnant of a different evolutionary path. And then there is the softer orphan of any species reading, where Cubone is less a strict biological child and more a symbol for any small creature who has lost the one who cared for it. Close your eyes and let your mind wander over what is written and what is only guessed. The Pokédex entries give you the crying, the skull, the mention of a dead mother again and again, but they almost never name that mother's species. The games show you one singular Marowak ghost in Lavender Tower, a spirit harmed by humans and finally set free. But they do not say that every Cubone in every region shares that exact story. The rest, the universal Marowak mother, the Kangaskhan connection, the idea that any parent could leave that skull behind, lives in the spaces between those lines, in the myth the community has woven. So when we whisper, it wasn't a Marowak, we are not erasing Lavender Town. That ancient pixelated Marowak still stands, still protects, still passes on. Instead, we are gently stepping back from the idea that her tragedy is the single template from which all Cubone must be stamped. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and the question begins to change shape. Rather than asking only what species was Cubone's mother, we can ask, what kind of story were the creators trying to tell? In that wider space, Cubone's origin starts to look less like a strict family tree and more like a parable about grief, about identity, and about the masks we learn to wear so we can keep walking through the world after loss. Tonight, we're drifting into the idea that Cubone's true origin might live in development notes, regional variants, and the quiet way later games turn its sorrow into ritual and resilience, not to punish, but to reset the way we think about sadness in this gentle universe. From here, we'll move through design sketches and Alolan flames, through changing Pokédex lines and shifting cultural echoes, not to solve Cubone like a math problem, but to sit beside it more fully. And as we do, you may notice that the real beginning of Cubone's story is not any one skull at all, but the moment Pokémon chose to teach children, softly, what it means to say goodbye. Unmasking the assumption, was Cubone's mother always a Marowak? From here, it helps to pause with the version of the story you already carry. To this day, most people could recite it in their sleep. Cubone's mother is a Marowak, she dies, and the little Pokémon takes her skull and wears it forever, crying softly as it looks up at the moon. It feels so settled, so complete, that your mind almost treats it like an ancient myth carved into stone. Close your eyes and let your mind wander just for a moment back to Lavender Town. In that quiet tower of graves there is one very specific spirit, the restless ghost of a Marowak, a mother who died protecting her child from Team Rocket. The game names her clearly, shows her form, lets you calm her so she can move on. It is a precise little story, set in one place at one point in time, yet over the years it has gently expanded in memory until it seems to cover every Cubone in the world. Players saw that one Marowak, that one Cubone, and the heart filled in the rest. Of course we think this must be how it always happens. Of course every skull must be a Marowak skull, every tear an echo of Lavender's ghost. In a series where patterns repeat and legends travel across regions, it feels natural to take one sad scene and let it become a template, a kind of quiet rule you never think to question. But when you turn back to the Pokédex and read the lines the way you might trace a fossil with your fingertips, a small uncertainty appears. Over and over, across generations and regions, the entries speak of its mother. They dwell on the skull, the grief, the crying that does not stop, yet they almost never say Marowak. The word simply isn't there. It is a tiny omission, a gap in the text, but in a series that chooses its details with care. Even a gap can mean something. Tonight, we're drifting into that gap, not to prove anyone wrong, but to see what else might live there. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, looking at a familiar story from a slightly different angle, the way moonlight changes the shape of a shadow on the floor. We are not here to erase Lavender Town or the way that Marowak's sacrifice settled into your childhood. We are only asking whether Cubone's sorrow might be larger and stranger than one species line. In the sections ahead, we will follow that question into alternative origins and hidden mothers, into designs that never fully surfaced, and regional rituals of mourning. For now, we simply let the question rest beside us, quiet and patient. If the Pokédex only says mother, who or what is missing beneath that skull? Let it echo softly at the edge of your thoughts, like a distant cry you can almost, but not quite, place. Reading between the lines, what the Pokédex doesn't say. So we turn back to the Pokédex itself, that quiet little book of truths and half-truths, and we notice how carefully it speaks around Cubone. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, and imagine those lines appearing on an old green Game Boy screen, simple and direct. Where's the skull of its deceased mother? Its cries echo inside the skull and come out as a sad melody, clear enough to make your heart ache. And yet, one word is missing. The entry does not say, "Where's the skull of its deceased Marowak mother?" It does not name a species at all. Later generations return to the same image, as if caught in a gentle loop. It pines for the mother it will never see again. Seeing a likeness of its mother in the full moon, it cries. The skull it wears on its head is that of its dead mother. According to some, it will cry loudly when it gets lonely. Again and again, the Pokédex offers the same emotional framing. Loneliness, grief, a keepsake worn as armor and as memory. But when it comes to the biological details, the text grows strangely quiet. No mention of an evolutionary line, no hint that this is simply what happens when a Marowak leaves an egg behind. To this day, across regions and remakes, the core of the story stays the same, while the specifics hover just out of reach, like the moon Cubone gazes at. In a world where family lines are usually mapped with almost scientific care, that absence feels at the very least conspicuous. Think of how often the Pokédex loves to define connections. It tells you that Pichu is a baby Pikachu, that Cleffa becomes Clefairy, that Ralts grows into a graceful Gardevoir. It traces ancestry, habitats, even shared myths between species. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer paging through an encyclopedia that usually delights in saying, "This becomes that." And yet here, with one of the most famous parent-child stories in the series, it stops at the single, unadorned word, mother. Tonight, we're drifting into the space between those missing letters. Gently imagine an alternate Pokédex, one that spoke just a little more plainly. Cubone wears the skull of its dead Marowak mother. The sadness would still be there, but the mystery would not. The story would close in on itself, neat and complete, leaving you less room to wonder what kind of world could create such a ritual of bone and memory. Instead, the writers leave that ritual half in shadow, which is often where the oldest myths like to live. In ancient times, storytellers knew that what you do not name can feel larger, older, closer to nature, and to the unknown. Lavender Town, with its tower of graves and its gentle, humming music, is a place built on that same balance of light and obscurity. The Pokédex gives you a child, a skull, and a grief that never quite heals, and then steps back, letting silence do the rest. As you drift deeper into the night, we will keep following those silences, those careful omissions, and see where they lead, because if the Pokédex refuses to say Marowak out loud, then somewhere beyond its pages, another story might be waiting, one that changes everything you thought you knew about the skull that Cubone wears. The Lavender Town, Marowak, a specific ghost, not a universal rule. So to follow that hidden story, you have to return to one very specific place, in one very specific time. The Lavender Town Pokémon Tower, and the single ghost that waits for you there. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that tall, grey structure rising above a quiet town, its windows like watchful eyes in the mist. Inside, and the world feels hushed. Bells chime softly, mediums whisper to unseen companions, and the air seems thicker, as if memories themselves have weight. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer moving carefully through a graveyard of old bonds. In that tower's story, the cruelty is simple and clear. Team Rocket has taken over the sacred space, harassing mourners and disturbing the graves, not to punish, but to reset the tower into something useful for their own schemes. Long before you arrive, they corner a Marowak, a mother defending her child. She is struck down, and her spirit cannot move on, bound by unfinished love and unquiet grief. When you climb the floors, you feel her presence before you see her. The mediums speak of a restless soul. The sylph scope reveals what your bare eyes cannot. The ghost is not a vague shape, but a clearly named Marowak. The game tells you so in plain text. And beside this tragedy, in that same tower, you meet a single Cubone, described as the orphan child of this very Marowak, still mourning the loss it cannot fully understand. To this day, that scene sits in people's memories like a candle in a dark room. It is poignant, localized, and very precise. One Cubone, one Marowak, one tower. Yet over time, something gentle and very human happens. The mind begins to smooth the edges, to compress the story, until the ghost of Cubone's mother in Lavender Town was a Marowak, quietly becomes Cubone's mother is always a Marowak. Tonight, we're drifting into that soft space where memory and myth overlap. When you remember Kanto, you might not recall the exact wording of a Pokédex entry or the way the text box specified that particular spirit. You remember the feeling, a small Pokémon in a skull crying for its mother, and a Marowak whose love lingers as a ghost. The details fold into a single, powerful image that feels like a rule, even though the game only ever shows you one example. Gently, you can place that image beside the broader Pokédex language. There, the phrasing is wider, almost careful. Cubone wears its dead mother's skull. It cries at night. The skull once belonged to the mother it lost. The tower gives you a case study. The Pokédex gives you a pattern, but without naming the species. So you are invited to hold two ideas at once. In Lavender Town, the Marowak is real specific and sacred within the story, an anchor in time and space. And yet, across the wider world, not every Cubone's skull has to trace back to that same template. Somewhere beyond the tower's dim corridors, other mothers, other shapes, and other histories might be waiting to be seen. A world full of skulls. Could every Cubone share the same tragedy? Out beyond Lavender's tower, the world keeps going.
Roots wind through grass and sand, regions unfold one after another, and in each of those quiet places there are Cubone, not just one grieving child in a haunted stairwell, but dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands over time, each one small, hunched, and wearing a pale, heavy skull. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment. Imagine walking slowly through Kanto, then Johto, then Hoenn and Sinnoh, your steps unhurried, your mind soft with sleep. In every patch of dry ground, in every moonlit field, you see that same silhouette, a Cubone tracing circles in the dust, clutching its bone, the same hollow-eyed mask turned toward the sky. If every skull is a mother and every mother is gone, the numbers begin to whisper something strange.
If we take the Pokédex at its most literal, the world becomes almost unbearably tragic. For every Cubone you meet in any game, there must have been a mother who lived long enough to be loved and then died at just the right moment for her skull to fit. Over generations, over regions, that would mean an entire species whose story is written around loss so absolute that hardly any adults remain to walk beside their young. Nature rarely works that way. Species endure because some parents live, because some cycles are allowed to complete. The games themselves seem to sense this. Many entries tell you that Cubone cries at night, that it gazes at the moon, that its tears leave marks on the bone it wears. To this day, some versions mention a deceased mother, but they do not always say that this is true of every single Cubone in existence, without exception, across all of time and space. Instead, they speak in a tone that feels closer to a proverb than a biology textbook. In ancient times, People told stories about stars falling from the sky or oceans born from the tears of gods, even if you do not say it aloud, that these are myths trying to express something emotional and vast. The details do not quite add up, but the feeling does. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer moving through a world where facts and feelings share the same gentle path. So perhaps every Cubone lost its mother is less a census report and more a kind of folklore within the Pokémon world, a way for people to talk about what Cubone represents, a small soul carrying visible grief, learning to move under its weight. A story repeated so often that it becomes an archetype, a pattern, a lens. Tonight we're drifting into that space where myth and nature overlap, because if the skull is an archetype rather than a rule, then other origins become possible, origins that keep the melancholy but bend the details. And just ahead, there are theories waiting in the dark, ready to lift the skull a little and show you what might be hiding underneath. The Kangaskhan connection, a motherly shadow in the background. And in that dim, in-between place, one shape begins to stand out from the others. Not Cubone, not Marowak, but a tall, gentle silhouette with a pouch and a watchful gaze. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you might see it too, standing just behind the tragedy you thought you knew. This is where the Kangaskhan theory steps quietly into the story. It suggests that Cubone is not a baby Marowak at all, but a baby Kangaskhan that has lost its mother, left alone in a world that suddenly feels far too wide. The idea is simple, almost childlike. The mother falls, the baby survives, and in its grief it takes the only piece of her it can still hold, the skull, and wears it like a helmet against the cold of time and memory. In this telling, that lonely child does not grow into Kangaskhan because the mother is gone. Instead, it hardens, it adapts, and it evolves into Marowak. When you picture them side by side, the myth gains a quiet kind of weight. Kangaskhan carries a baby in her pouch, a small, round-headed creature with a short tail and a simple, sturdy body. Remove the armor plates, imagine the soft skin beneath, and place a skull over that little face, and suddenly you begin to see the outline of Cubone. The stance, the proportions, even the way both lines cradle their young or their bone club, all of it invites you to trace a hidden connection in the empty space between sprites. To this day, fans point to old rumors and half-remembered images from early development as if they were fragments of an ancient tablet. There are whispers about unused or beta evolutionary lines, about a time when Kangaskhan, Cubone, and Marowak may have been drawn closer together in the design documents, only to be separated before the games reached your hands. None of this has ever been confirmed in canon, of course. It lingers more as a shared dream than as official history, a possibility that lives between pixels and imagination. Part of why this theory endures is emotional rather than logical. Kangaskhan is one of the purest images of motherhood in the Pokémon world, always shown shielding her child, keeping it close, moving her whole body to maintain that fragile balance of protection and freedom. To link Cubone's grief to the loss of such a mother feels symbolically powerful, as if the universe itself had taken the most devoted parent it could imagine and allowed a single child to remain, wandering under the weight of her memory. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. And in that dreaming space, the Kangaskhan theory becomes less a claim about data and more a bedtime story the community tells itself. Official material stays quiet. The Pokédex never steps forward to confirm it. Yet the theory persists because it reveals something true about the listeners. It shows how deeply players want to understand Cubone's pain, to give it a lineage, a lost embrace, a mother whose shadow still stretches softly over the little skull. And just beyond this motherly silhouette, other possibilities are waiting. different origins that try, in their own ways, to cradle the same small, aching heart. Sprites, shapes, and lost lines. Design echoes between species. Just beyond that motherly silhouette, the shapes themselves begin to whisper. Close your eyes and let your mind wander. And imagine you are paging through an old guidebook, its colors slightly faded, its pixels soft around the edges. On one page, Cubone stands there, small and hunched, its head bowed beneath the skull, tail curled like a question mark, as if the weight of memory has gently folded its whole body toward the ground. On the next page, Marowak appears, sharing the same skull motif, but holding its bone like a staff. Its back is straighter, its stance more assured, as though time and sorrow have taught it how to carry what once nearly crushed it. The tail is thicker, the limbs a little longer, the silhouette stretched upward, yet still echoing that original lonely curve you saw in Cubone. It feels like a future version of the same quiet story, written in slightly bolder lines. Turn another page and Kangaskhan steps into view, large and protective, with that familiar sturdy tail and rounded snout. The mother leans forward, arms ready to shield, while the baby in her pouch peers out with a shape that feels, to this day, strangely adjacent to Cubone-'s. Tonight, we're drifting into that space between them, the place where fans began to imagine the pouch baby growing up on its own, skull-like head exposed, body proportions slowly aligning with that little orphan holding a bone. When you look only at outlines, at the curve of a back, or the way a tail balances the body, the resemblances become even more pronounced. Early sprites, limited by hardware and by the tiny stage of a Game Boy screen, reduced every creature to a handful of shared poses and angles. A hunched child, a standing guardian, a towering parent, 3 stages that feel like they could belong to a single, secret evolutionary line, even if the games never say so. In ancient times of development, before you ever walked through Pallet Town, evolutionary families were sketched, rearranged, and sometimes gently set aside. Prototype sheets show creatures who lost their place, lines that were cut or spliced, leaving behind stray shapes and ideas that found new homes in other designs. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer tracing those echoes, wondering if Cubone, Marowak, and Kangaskhan once shared more than just a mood. Game artists often reuse what feels right, a successful pose, a pleasing curve of tail, a certain way a jawline suggests strength or tenderness, not to punish, but to reset. They carry an old idea into a new form, adjusting it to keep the world in visual balance. The result is a quiet tapestry of recurring silhouettes that can make unrelated species feel like distant relatives meeting again in the margins. Your mind, especially when you care, is eager to weave these echoes into myth. You see the baby in the pouch, the lonely Cubone, the resolute Marowak, and you want the pixels to confess a hidden genealogy, a lost child who stepped out of one family and into another. Even if Cubone was never meant to be a misplaced Kangaskhan, the shared curves and poses create a dreamlike possibility, a soft suggestion that somewhere behind the sprites and the code there might have been a different origin, a different cradle waiting just off screen. And from these visual murmurs, the theories only grow more intricate, reaching beyond shapes into timelines, regions, and forgotten experiments that try to explain how such echoes came to be. Game Freak speaks official responses and quiet silences. From those visual echoes, your thoughts might drift quite naturally toward the people who shaped them. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, and imagine the quiet rooms at Game Freak, where Cubone, Marowak, and Kangaskhan were once only sketches on paper, ideas passing between designers in low voices. Over the years, a few of those voices have reached the surface, In interviews and guidebooks, staff have spoken about wanting Pokémon that expressed sadness or that showed the gentler side of loss. They mention Cubone's crying, the way it looks up at the moon, the way its Pokédex entry lingers on the skull of its dead mother. They confirm the sorrow, the image, the mood. But they never quite say whose skull it is, never state plainly in any official place that this tragedy belongs to Marowak alone, or to Kangaskhan, or to some other hidden parent. To this day, the Kangaskhan theory lives mostly in that empty space. Designers have been asked about it at events and in magazines, and the answers tend to be soft and sidelong. They smile, they say it is an interesting idea, they say fans notice many things, and then they move on. No diagrams, no timelines, no firm declaration that Cubone was once meant to be a baby Kangaskhan, or that it never was. The story is acknowledged only by its outline, like a shadow at the edge of the campfire. In ancient times, myths survived in exactly this way, through suggestion more than explanation. Game Freak and the Pokémon Company often seem to prefer that older method. Rather than locking every thread of lore into a single, official meaning, they leave some details just out of reach, allowing speculation to rise and fall like a quiet tide. The Pokédex repeats the same core image of the grieving child, but adjusts the framing, the emphasis, the regional color, without ever closing the door on alternative readings. The result is a kind of gentle haze around Cubone's history. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer wandering between overlapping stories where Cubone is a baby Marowak in one telling, an orphaned Kangaskhan in another, and in a third, simply a small creature whose parent could have been anyone at all. None of these paths are crowned as the single, shining canon. None are truly denied. You can almost sense that the creators might enjoy that mystique, especially for a Pokémon so closely tied to memory and loss. A clear answer would be simple, but perhaps a little too sharp for this world. Instead, Cubone moves forward under its skull, living with a past it can't fully see, only feel, just as you move through the games with a story you can't completely confirm, only imagine. Tonight we're drifting into that shared uncertainty, where official words stay soft and indistinct, and because of that, you are free to keep tracing new quiet paths through Cubone's possible origins, following whichever thread your dreaming mind finds next. Beyond Marowak and Kangaskhan, the orphan of any species theory. From that uncertainty, another quieter idea begins to take shape, like fog curling around the base of Pokémon Tower and never fully lifting. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine that Cubone is not a species in the usual sense at all, but a story that certain young Pokémon step into when their own story is suddenly broken. In this orphan of any species theory, Cubone is less a fixed creature and more a role, a form that grief itself can carve. A Rhyhorn calf that loses its mother in the wild, a small sand shrew separated in a storm, even a Kangaskhan child left without the warmth of its parent's pouch. Each one, at the moment of loss, might be drawn toward the same quiet shape in the world, not to become something stronger or more powerful, but to become something that understands its own sorrow. In that view, the skull is no longer a biological guarantee. The Pokédex tells you again and again that Cubone wears its dead mother's skull, yet almost never pauses to say what that mother actually was. The bone could be from a Marowak if you want to connect it back to Lavender Town, but it could just as easily be the remains of another Pokémon found on a lonely hillside, or even a crafted mask made to resemble what the child remembers. The skull becomes a symbol, a piece of the world that grief can hold on to when everything else has slipped away. Tonight we're drifting into a world where that symbol is like a universal language of mourning. Wherever a Cubone walks, other Pokémon seem to understand without words that this is a child who has known loss. Its quiet crying at night, its way of gazing up at the moon as if searching a different sky, become part of a shared ritual, almost like the funeral dances of Alalan Marowak, where flames and memory move together in careful balance. Seen this way, the Pokédex's vagueness starts to feel less like an oversight and more like a deliberate softening. If Cubone can be born from many different tragedies, the world doesn't need countless identical Marowak deaths. It only needs a single, ancient pattern of loss that repeats in many small personal ways. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing how sorrow might crystallize into a familiar silhouette whenever a young heart is left alone. Of course, this idea bends the neat lines of typing, moves, and evolution. How would such different young Pokémon all become ground type, all learn the same techniques, all grow into the same Marowak form? The mechanics stay firm while the myth stretches, and you are gently reminded that we're wandering more through story than through science, more through dream than through data. And if Cubone is an identity born from loss, not a single fixed species, then the question lingers softly over your drifting thoughts. What does it mean, in the end, that the mask it chooses to wear is always a skull and never its own face? The skull as a mask, identity, inheritance, and disguise. Close your eyes and let your mind wander and think about what it means to put on another face. In ancient times, in our own world as well as in this gentle world of Pokémon, masks were not just decorations, they were bridges worn in quiet ceremonies to invite ancestors close, to keep away harm, or to step, for a moment, into a different story. Tonight, we're drifting into that idea through Cubone's skull. The Pokédex tells you again and again that it wears its dead mother's bone, that it cries at night, that its tears stain the skull it cannot remove. The language is simple, but the image is old, almost ritual. A child taking up what is left of a parent, not just as a keepsake, but as something to live inside, the way a mask in a festival is more than wood and paint. On Cubone, the skull is not a small ornament, it covers almost everything. Only those round, uncertain eyes and the hint of a soft muzzle peek through the empty sockets and the grinning jaw. Its own features are framed, swallowed, and blurred by the shape of another. You see it from a distance, and to this day, you recognize the skull first, the child second. The mother's outline walks before the child's. Over time, if you were that child, always looking out through borrowed bone, you might begin to wonder where you end. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer who grows up staring through their grief, learning every curve and crack of the mask until it feels like skin. You might start to feel less like yourself and more like an extension of the one you lost, inheriting not only a bone, but a role you never chose. That is where the orphan of any species theory becomes less like a puzzle and more like a myth. Perhaps becoming a Cubone is not about a strict bloodline at all, not about whether the skull once belonged to a Marowak or a Kangaskhan or something the games never name. Perhaps it is about a certain way of grieving, a child so bound to loss that they step into it fully, the way a shrine maiden steps into a mask during an ancient dance, not to punish, but to reset the balance between presence and absence. If that is true, then Cubone's evolution into Marowak can feel less like a simple biological change and more like a coming of age within the story of the skull. The Pokédex hints that as Marowak, the grief hardens into resolve, the crying stops, the movements grow short, the bone becomes a weapon of rhythm and ritual. The mask no longer looks oversized. It fits, as though the child has grown into the legend they have been wearing all along. And so you can picture it now. A small figure in the dark, perched at the edge of some forgotten patch of Lavender Town soil, holding a bone almost as long as its body. The wind moves softly through the tower, through the eye sockets of the skull. In that quiet space, even Cubone seems unsure where its own face ends and where its mother's memory, wrapped around it like a second skin, begins. regional variants, and shifting myths. Alolan Marowak's fire dance. From that lonely image in Lavender's shadowed tower, the story could stay small and personal, a single child and a single skull. But the world of Pokémon has a way of taking one quiet story and letting it echo in different lands, under different skies. Tonight, we're drifting into a place where Cubone's sorrow does not vanish, but changes shape. Far across the sea, in Alola, Marowak is not the heavy, earthbound figure you first met in Kanto. Its body is slimmer, its eyes sharper, and the bone it carries burns with ghostly green-blue fire, twirling in slow arcs like a lantern in the dark. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can almost see it, a ring of Alolan Marowak on a blackened hilltop, moving in unison, their flames cutting gentle patterns into the night air like a ritual dance. In ancient times, people in Alola watched this dance and saw more than a simple display of strength. The Pokédex tells you that Alolan Marowak developed its eerie flames as a response to predators, learning to wield fire and ghostly energy to ward off those who hunted it. Yet the way it moves, circling and stamping, feels less like panic and more like ceremony, as if each step is a funerary rite and each swirl of the bone is a protective charm for the spirits watching nearby. Where the Cantonian Marowak in Lavender Tower is remembered as a single, restless ghost, Alolan Marowak feels like an entire lineage that has learned to live with ghosts, to invite them into the dance. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, watching from the edge of a volcanic field, as grief is turned outward, transformed into light and rhythm. The same line that once seemed defined only by mourning now carries something else. The suggestion that sorrow can become guardianship. To this day, Alolan Marowak's descriptions speak of it as a protector, one that channels its pain into flames that keep others safe. It no longer reads only as a victim of tragedy. It stands more like a keeper of it, a small guardian at the threshold between the living and the dead, holding its bone like a torch that remembers. The skull is still there, the past is still heavy, but the posture has changed. The head is lifted. And so you can imagine Cubone in Alola, looking up at that dancing silhouette against the lava glow. Its Pokédex entries may still mention the lost mother, the tears that fall onto the skull and leave quiet stains. Yet the culture wrapped around that sadness is different now. In this region, the path forward is not only to endure loss, but to shape it into ritual, into a shared language of flame and motion. If one species can carry such different myths in different corners of the same world, then perhaps Cubone's mother is not bound to a single, fixed story either. Maybe the skull is Cantonian Marowak in one place, another ancestor in a distant land, or even a symbol more than a strict record. The myth bends but does not break. It adjusts to keep balance with the land that tells it. As the series moves on from Kanto and Alola, the world itself seems to learn new ways to hold Cubone's grief, sometimes softening it, sometimes deepening it, as if the story is growing alongside you. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow those later entries and gentle reinterpretations and watch how a small Pokémon sadness slowly becomes a conversation between generations, rather than a single, unchanging wound. From horror to hush, how, later, generations reframe. Cubone's grief. From there, you can almost feel the Pokédex itself exhale, as if the world grew a little older and a little more careful with its words. Is so sad it makes others cry as well, is so sad it makes others cry as well. There is no comfort offered there. Only a quiet, unblinking statement of loss. As time moves forward and new regions open like pages in a long ancient book, the language begins to soften. In later entries, you're told that if it is sad or lonely, it will brandish the bone its mother left behind, swinging it with surprising strength. The focus tilts just slightly, away from the wound and toward the way this small Pokémon learns to stand under the weight it carries. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer learning how to walk with grief. In some Pokédex lines, that slow change is almost tender. One mentions that Cubone's loneliness wears off as it grows used to the skull, as if familiarity itself becomes a kind of gentle armor. Another says it cries less and less as time passes and instead channels its feelings into that bone, using it to protect itself. The same object that once symbolized a final goodbye becomes, over years of retelling, a staff to lean on, a reminder that love can remain as strength. You can sense this series adjusting its balance, aware that new generations of children are reading these entries before sleep, meeting Cubone for the first time. The tone of the whole franchise shifts, not by erasing sadness, but by framing it as something you can live with. Alolan's stories will later describe Marowak dancing with ghostly fire, not to punish, but to reset grief into ritual, and Cubone feels like the seed of that idea, sorrow that learns to move. Yet the original tragedy never truly disappears. To this day, those early Kanto words still sit at the foundation, like the lowest floors of a tower in Lavender Town. Each new description settles on top of them like layers of dust, or like sediment in a river of memories, creating depth rather than replacement. You are not asked to forget the crying child under the skull. You are invited to imagine what happens after the crying slows. And somewhere in that evolution is a quieter understanding. Perhaps not every Cubone has the same story, or the same mother, or the same ending. The species becomes a myth about grief itself, rather than a single, rigid script every individual must follow. Tonight we're drifting into a world where stories, like living creatures, can molt and grow new shells around the same fragile heart. Pokémon tales are retold over time, but the quiet ache at their core remains, steady enough to keep you company as you drift towards sleep. Children, loss, gentle ghost stories in Pokémon. In the world of bright colors and simple shapes, Cubone's story feels like a small stone at the bottom of a clear pond, heavy and still, yet sending out quiet ripples. To this day, it remains one of the most unusual choices Game Freak ever made for a series so often associated with adventure, friendship, and cheerful music. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to the late 1990s, when most children's games carefully stepped around the subject of death. Enemies were defeated, robots shut down, characters simply disappeared off-screen. Yet in Kanto, you walk into Lavender Town and are told plainly that Pokémon have died. There is a tower that is not a dungeon but a graveyard. There are ghosts that are not metaphors but restless spirits in a sacred space. Lavender Town and the Pokémon Tower form a kind of gentle boundary around this theme. You move through dim floors lined with tombstones, guided by channelers and soft chimes, as if the game is taking your hand and saying, "Here, in this one place, we will talk about loss. Not everywhere, not all the time, just within these walls, where the music slows and the world grows quiet enough for mourning." Within that tower, Cubone is waiting, like a small lantern in the dark. Its Pokédex entries repeat the same simple image, a little creature that wears its dead mother's skull, that cries at night, that gazes at the moon as if looking for someone it can no longer reach. For a child, grief is often like that, not a complex philosophy, but a single object, a photo, a toy, a smell, standing in for a whole relationship that the mind can't fully hold. Cubone's skull becomes that object. You are never asked to see the body. You are never shown the moment of parting. You only see the mask, the tears, and the way it never takes that bone helmet off. The story is repetitive on purpose. Like a lullaby, with the same line over and over, comforting in its predictability, even as it hints at something ancient and aching beneath. Tonight we're drifting into a wider pattern that stretches far beyond Kanto. Later generations would bring other gentle ghost stories. The girl in the strange house in Unova, the lonely spirit on the marvelous bridge, the bittersweet tales of Yamask remembering its human life, or phantoms said to be born from lost children in the forest. Small, optional paths, side rooms off the main road. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer wandering through myths about memory and letting go. Yet Cubone remains one of the earliest, clearest symbols of that tradition. The games rarely specify what species its mother truly was, and the exact origin of the skull is left soft at the edges like a drawing smudged with a thumb. That ambiguity may be the point, an open space where each player can quietly place their own understanding of loss, whether they know grief well or only as a distant shape. In that way, Cubone stops being just a sad Pokémon and becomes a kind of quiet companion, especially for anyone who misses someone they can't quite remember clearly, or whose memory feels more like an object than a person. The little ground type, wrapped in its borrowed bone, walks beside you up the tower stairs, saying nothing, carrying its story like a shell. And as you leave Lavender Town behind, the question that lingers is not only who Cubone once was without that skull, but what other memories in this world are still waiting, just out of sight, to put on a mask of their own. Designing sorrow, how flavored text carries emotional weight. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, back to the first time you opened the Pokédex and saw Cubone's entry. The screen was small, the colors simple, but the words lingered. It wears the skull of its deceased mother and cries at the moon. In that quiet description, Game Freak builds a whole world of sorrow with almost nothing. Over and over, across regions and generations, the same structure returns. First, the skull mentioned like a second skin, then the crying. It weeps, it sobs, its tears fall and stain the bone. Finally, almost as an aside, the lost mother referenced in a single line, as if the story is too heavy to stay in the foreground for long. The pattern feels gentle, but insistent, like a lullaby of loss. Tonight, we're drifting into the spaces between those sentences. Because each entry is so brief, your imagination naturally reaches out to complete it. You picture the moment the skull was first placed on that small head, the first night alone under the sky, the way the sound of its crying might echo through tall grass or along the stone corridors of Lavender Town. The text never says how the mother died or what her last moments were like, so you fill in the myth yourself, almost without noticing. This minimalism is part of a larger language the series uses for grief and eeriness. Think of Yamask, whose Pokédex whispers that it carries a mask of its human face, or Phantom, said to be the spirit of a lost child in a forest. Their entries, too, rely on a single vivid image. But Cubone's lines recur more often and more consistently than almost any of them. To this day, phrases about its crying, its skull, and its mother form a kind of refrain, repeated in new regions like an ancient story being retold around a campfire. Over time, these small choices accumulate. By the time you see Cubone's sprite tilt its head or its 3D model clutching that bone in a quiet pose, you are not just seeing a ground-type Pokémon. You are seeing every sentence you have ever read about it, layered in memory. The moonlit crying, the stained skull, the unseen parent. A few words have become an entire emotional narrative that lives in the space between player and screen. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and so even the missing details matter. The Pokédex almost never tells you what species the mother truly was. It could have said Marowak every time, but it rarely does, leaving the figure of the mother soft around the edges like a silhouette in fog. Because she is undefined, she becomes easier to imagine, to project your own sense of loss or tenderness onto whatever your age, whatever your world. In a series painted with bright colors and cheerful music, these few quiet sentences stand out like a candle in a dark room. They do not exist to frighten you, but to create balance, to show that even in a gentle universe of companionship, there is room for mourning and memory. And somehow, with just those fragments of flavor text, a lonely little Pokémon story has echoed through decades of games, waiting for you to read it again and wonder what truths might be hidden in the bones it wears. If it wasn't a Marowak, imagining alternative mothers. And once you notice that echo, you start to hear the quiet question beneath it. If the Pokédex never quite insists that Cubone's mother was a Marowak, and if the restless spirit in Lavender Town is only one singular story, then somewhere in this wide world of grass and stone and starlight, there may have been other mothers, other shapes, other skulls. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, away from the tower and its morning bells. Picture a Cubone standing at the edge of a desert, the sand warm beneath its feet, cradled once by a towering ground type whose skull was broader or narrower or marked with strange ancient ridges from a life spent burrowing through the earth. The bone it wears now might curve a little differently, the eyes sockets a touch higher or lower, the snout longer like a sand slash or rounded like a nidoqueen. Fans have long whispered about Kangaskhan, about the pouch and the baby, and the way its silhouette almost seems to rhyme with Cubones. In that gentle myth, the mother falls, and the child takes the skull as a promise never to forget. But you can imagine other quieter stories too. A Cubone whose mother was a simple, unrelated Pokémon that loved it fiercely, a normal type that grazed in the fields, or a rock type that watched the stars with it at night. When that parent is gone, what remains is not a perfect anatomical match, but a memory carved into bone. The artwork you know, the standardized skull with its familiar horns and rounded brow, may be less a literal fossil and more an emblem. Game Freak's artists, drawing for a world of dreams rather than a museum of skeletons, could have smoothed away the individual differences, leaving you with an archetype, an average mother distilled into a single, iconic shape. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. The lines are simplified so the story can be carried in a glance. In that sense, the skull becomes something softer than a specimen. It is a symbol of care, lost, of warmth that once wrapped around a small, lonely creature. For Cubone, the exact species might matter far less than the bond itself, the way that bone still smells faintly of home, the way it balances on its head like a hand that never quite lets go. To this day, the Pokédex speaks of grief and tears, but almost never of taxonomy, and the games, protective in their own quiet way, will likely never lift that mask. You are never shown a Cubone without its skull, never given the final, definitive answer that would turn a myth into a diagram. Tonight, we're drifting into a space where that mystery is allowed to breathe, where somewhere out there, in the tall grass, or the forgotten corners of the tower, there may be mothers you've never thought to look for, waiting in the margins of the story for someone like you to wonder about them. A species born of stories. Cubone as collective memory. In that quiet margin, where unanswered questions linger like mist around the tower, Cubone begins to feel less like a single creature and more like a doorway. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can almost sense the different stories pressing gently against that little skull, each one trying to explain who it is and who it once belonged to. The most familiar story is the one the games quietly suggest, a Marowak mother, standing between her child and harm, leaving behind only a skull and a lingering presence on one haunted floor. It is simple, almost elegant, and it fits the Pokédex lines that speak of a child wearing its dead mother's bones, crying to the moon. To this day, many players never look beyond that, and in a way that simplicity becomes its own kind of comfort. But then another story slips in from the edges of the fandom's dream. The Kangaskhan theory imagines Cubone as a lost baby, separated from the safety of a living pouch, clutching a skull that might once have been the head of its own protector. In this telling, the roundness of Cubone's body, the shape of its tail, even the way it seems half child, half guardian, become echoes of a different lineage. The world does not confirm this myth, but it doesn't quite close the door on it either. A third story is gentler still and perhaps a little sadder. Here, Cubone is not tied to Marowak or Kangaskhan alone, but is instead the orphan child of many possible species, any small Pokémon whose mother never came back from the wild. The skull becomes less a specific relic and more a symbol, a mask that grief shapes to fit. Some Pokédex entries hint that the skulls differ in form, as if each one remembers a different face beneath. In that sense, the skull is not only bone, but language. It is the way Cubone speaks its sadness to the world without words, the way it holds on to something tangible when memory might otherwise fade. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer tracing the outline of a mask and wondering who first placed it there. The mask hides, but it also protects. It turns raw loss into a story that can be carried. When you meet a Cubone, you bring your own story with you. You might see a Marowak child, forever linked to Lavender Town's ghost. You might see a misplaced Kangaskhan baby, wandering too far from its ancient family. You might choose to see a nameless orphan whose mother never needed a species, only a presence. Each trainer, each player completes the myth in a slightly different way. And strangely, this doesn't weaken Cubone at all. It makes it richer, like a song that sounds a little different in every region but is always recognizable by its first quiet notes. Tonight we're drifting into a way of seeing Cubone, not as a solved diagram, but as a nexus of stories, a small point in space where grief, remembrance, and companionship intersect. Perhaps Cubone's true origin is not anchored in any one mother, but in the collective memory of everyone who has ever paused in Lavender Town and listened, really listened, to its distant cries under a pixelated moon. In ancient times, myths survived because people kept telling them. In this modern, digital world, Cubone survives because you keep wondering. And so, having gently unthreaded what Cubone's mother might not be, we can begin to turn toward a softer, deeper question. If the origin remains unresolved, what does Cubone grow into, carrying a mystery instead of an answer? And where does that path of quiet bones and borrowed masks finally lead? Tracing the skull. Could Cubone inherit any mother's bones? To follow that path, you can, if you like, close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment back to something very small, a single line in a book. The Pokédex, in game after game, tells you that Cubone wears its mother's skull, that it cries at night, that the stains on the bone are from its own tears. But to this day, those entries almost never say what that mother was. They do not name Marowak. They do not whisper, "This was once a proud ground-type warrior." They simply say, "It's mother." That quiet absence of a species, that little gap in the sentence, opens up a surprising amount of space. In a world where legends name Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, where ancient myths recite titles and domains, Cubone's most important figure is left strangely undefined, as if the story is inviting you to imagine someone specific, and yet no one in particular. Tonight, we're drifting into that gap, into the space between what is written and what is assumed. If you set aside the image of a Marowak just for a moment, a softer possibility appears. Biologically, it might seem odd. How could a Pokémon inherit or claim a skull that does not match its own exact anatomy? Yet in this quiet story, anatomy has always been secondary to emotion. The Pokédex lingers on Cubone's grief, on its loneliness, on the way it holds the bone like a keepsake, not on whether the eye sockets line up with perfect precision. In nature, you sometimes see creatures adopt what they find. Birds weaving bits of human cloth into nests, Pokémon like Cofagrigus and Runerigus, binding themselves to objects that were never meant for them. In that same mythic logic, Cubone might be less a biological heir and more a spiritual one, choosing, or being given, the skull of the one who cared for it, regardless of species. The Bond writes the rule, not the skeleton. From this thought grows the gentle, any species orphan theory. In this telling, Cubone could be born to many different mothers, perhaps a Sandslash who sheltered it in a burrow, a Kangaskhan who carried it close, even a caring, non-ground type who happened to live on the edge of a rocky plain. When loss comes, the skull becomes a universal emblem of grief, a mask that says, "Someone loved me once," rather than, "I am a baby Marowak." The tears, the loneliness, the way it gazes at the moon remain the same, even if the unseen face it remembers would have looked very different. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and in that dreamlike space, Cubone's ambiguity begins to feel deliberate. Some Pokémon have lore that is rigid and sharply defined. The twin dragon of Unova split cleanly into Reshiram and Zekrom. Ho-Oh resurrected exactly 3 beasts in Johto, not 2, not 4, not to punish, but to reset a broken balance. Their numbers are fixed, their roles almost ceremonial. Cubone is different, its story leaves room, like a half-finished prayer. By never quite saying this was a Marowak and only a Marowak, the games allow any player in any time to place their own quiet loss behind that skull. And as we move forward, we can begin to wonder not just who the mother was, but how a life shaped around absence might slowly, gently, become something new. Not the orphan of any species. Imagining different mothers for Cubone. So if the story is half finished, you're invited to finish it in your own way. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine Cubone not as a single tragedy, but as a shape that could hold many different mothers, many different worlds of memory, all hidden behind that quiet, bone-white mask. In one version of the story, the mother was a Sandslash. The world is a broad, starlit desert where the air cools quickly after sundown and dunes move like slow waves in the dark. A small Cubone stands on a ridge of sand, the skull on its head, scoured smooth by wind and dust, the eye sockets faintly lined with grains that never quite shake loose. In ancient times, Sandslash mothers would burrow deep, curling around their young as the desert night grew cold, their spines a living shelter against the shifting ground. Now when this Cubone tilts its head, the skull remembers that sound, the low hiss of sand slipping past claws, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, the soft thrum of the earth cooling after the sun. The loss is still there, but it is dry and spacious, like the desert itself, a grief worn down into something almost polished. In another telling, the mother was a Kangaskhan, and the story feels different from the first breath. Tonight we're drifting into a quieter corner of that myth, not to prove a theory, but to sit with the feeling it carries. Picture a grassy plain at dusk, a Kangaskhan cradling a tiny, helmetless Cubone against her chest, the heavy rhythm of her heartbeat a steady drum the child grows to trust. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, held and protected. When the mother is gone, the skull Cubone wears might seem less like armor and more like an echo of an embrace. The the curve of bone recalling the curve of a pouch, the way the world once felt, safely enclosed. To this day, some players look at Cubone and see that missing shelter, that vanished warmth, and the skull becomes not only a symbol of death, but of a love so protective that its absence leaves a hollow that never quite closes. Then move with the story toward water. Imagine a Cubone whose parent was a quagsire, or perhaps a Paldean whooper, drifting through a marsh where time feels slow and kind. The skull here is often damp at the edges, marked with faint traces of algae and silt, as if the past itself were a shoreline that keeps gently lapping at the present. The parent in this version was easygoing, floating along the current, bumping into stones and logs with a placid smile, teaching the child that the world could be soft, that mistakes could slide away like ripples in a pond. When that presence disappears, the skull becomes a relic of a carefree, drifting life now gone, a reminder that even the most relaxed, smiling guardians cannot stay forever. All of these are only possibilities, quiet sketches in the space the Pokédex leaves open. They are not meant as strict canon, but as meditations on how grief changes shape depending on the life that came before it, how nature and nurture both leave fingerprints on bone, and if Cubone could have worn a desert skull, or a pouch-shaped memory, or a waterlogged mask, then we have to ask, what did Game Freak know and choose not to say about the very first skull Cubone ever put on? When tragedy becomes a pattern, are all Cubone destined to lose their mothers? And once you notice that silence around the first skull, your mind drifts back to something else the games keep repeating again and again in that same quiet, matter-of-fact tone. Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother. Not a mother, its mother. The Pokédex, from Kanto onward, speaks as if this were not an accident or a rare sorrow, but the very definition of what Cubone is. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment over those entries. In Red and Blue, it cries at the moon, mourning the mother it will never see again. In Fire Red, its tears stain the skull. In later generations, the wording softens or shifts, but the core idea remains, returning like a refrain across time and space. To this day, the text rarely allows for a living mother at all. Read literally, it sounds almost like a curse laid on an entire species, but the Pokédex is a strange kind of book. It is part field guide, part campfire story, part half-remembered myth told by professors who were once children themselves. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer moving through a world where even facts bend toward poetry. You are meant to feel the ache of Cubone's loss, but perhaps not to chart it as a strict biological rule. Many entries across the series exaggerate, treating one striking behavior as if it were universal. A Pokémon that never sleeps, another that can melt anything, a guardian that appears whenever nature is threatened, not to punish, but to reset the balance. You sense that these are archetypes, not census data. In that same way, Cubone may be the emblem of orphaned grief, the child in mourning made into a species rather than a literal statement that every single Cubone in existence has already stood at a grave. If you let the mind loosen a little, softer readings appear. Perhaps some Cubone lose their mothers later in life, and the Pokédex speaks as though that moment has already come, compressing time into a single, haunting image. Perhaps certain entries remember a specific region, a particular tragedy like the one in Lavender Town, where many Cubone were left alone at once, and the story generalized over generations until it became what Cubone are. And yet there is a darker possibility that the games never quite deny, that Cubone, as an idea, is bound to grief, that its very name is a promise of loneliness. Tonight, we're drifting into that shadowed space, but we do not have to stay there forever. Later, stories offer small lanterns in the dark. In Alola, Marowak dances with ghostly fire, transforming mourning into ritual. In side stories and quiet quests, you sometimes see Cubone cared for by humans, or standing beside other Pokémon who have become its new family. The world of Pokémon, like our own, is full of losses you cannot undo, but it is also full of found homes and gentle, chosen bonds. If Cubone begins as a myth of universal bereavement, the later games whisper an addendum. Grief may shape you, but it does not have to be the only story written in your bones. And if that is true, then the question becomes not only how Cubone lost its first family, but how it learns to accept a second one and what that implies about the mother behind the mask at all. Echoes in the night, Cubone's cry, and the sound of remembered love. And if that is true, then the question becomes not only how Cubone lost its first family, but how it learns to accept a second one, and what that implies about the mother behind the mask at all. Close your eyes and let your mind wander just for a moment, back to the very first stories the games ever told you about this tiny, lonely shape under a too large skull. In Red and Blue, the Pokédex speaks with a kind of quiet certainty. Cubone pines for its deceased mother, and at night its cries echo sadly. Later entries add small variations, but the rhythm is the same. It looks at the moon and remembers. It weeps until it tires itself out. It wears the skull and cannot forget. Read this not as a simple description of a sad Pokémon, but as a ritual schedule, a nightly ceremony of remembrance, as regular as the phases of the moon itself. When you picture Cubone like that, the skull stops being only a mask and becomes an instrument. The curved bone over its head is a shield, yes, keeping the world at a careful distance, softening the sharp edges of nature and time, but it is also a hollow chamber, a shell that catches sound. Each sob, each trembling breath bounces inside and emerges changed, amplified, like a tiny bell tower of grief ringing out over the grass. The echo is not there to disturb the world. It is there to keep the memory from fading. Tonight we're drifting into the way that echo mirrors the things humans do when they grieve. In ancient times, and in your own, people light candles in windows so that someone's absence has a visible place. They walk to quiet graves with flowers, or keep a photograph on a bedside table, or a scarf in a drawer that still holds a familiar scent. Children's stories cannot carry every detail of loss, so they turn those complicated rituals into one simple image. A small creature, alone under the stars, crying into a skull that once was warm and alive. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, learning that memory and identity are tangled together. To this day, the Pokédex rarely tells you what species that mother was. It tells you instead what Cubone does with its missing presence. The origin of the skull becomes a mystery of species and theories, but the constancy of the crying is not a mystery at all. It is habit, devotion, a promise kept every night. In that sense, the more interesting question is no longer whose skull it is, but why Cubone keeps choosing to wear it, even when the weight must be heavy. The bone is grief made visible, but it is also the shape that guides Cubone toward Marowak, toward a future self that has learned to dance with fire and memory rather than be swallowed by them. And as we move deeper into this story, the origin of the mask will matter less than the way the one beneath it learns to live. From ghosts to guardians, how, later, games reframe Cubone's sorrow. By the time you meet Cubone in later regions, that first sharp sting of tragedy has softened into something different, something almost luminous. The skull is still there, the tears are still there, but the world around Cubone has begun to answer its sorrow instead of only reflecting it back. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can feel that shift like a quiet change in the weather. In Alola, Marowak steps out of the tower's shadow and into firelight. This regional form does not simply mourn, it dances with ghostly blue flames, spinning its bone like a torch in a ritual that feels part war dance, part memorial, and part prayer. Pokédex entries describe Alolan Marowak as a guardian of the lonely, a keeper of wayward spirits that gathers with its kind to perform eerie, protective dances under the moon. The parent that once lingered as a restless ghost in Lavender Town has, in this far-off island world, become almost shamanic, guiding other spirits, not to punish, but to reset the balance between the living and the dead. When you look back at Cubone's own entries, you start to notice that, even in earlier generations, there were hints of this resilience. Yes, it cries at night, staring up at the moon it mistakes for its mother's face, but you also read that it becomes tougher from each tear shed, that it endures harsh deserts, that it trains itself by swinging the very bone that once symbolized its loss. To this day, later, Pokédex lines quietly emphasize its determination, its stubborn will to stand up again, so the emotional weight shifts from pure grief toward a gentle, steady courage that grows in the middle of that grief. The games themselves begin to invite you into that healing. In Pokémon Amy, in Refresh, in the quiet space of a Galar campsite, you are allowed to sit with Cubone, to feed it, to brush away dust, to watch it tilt its skull and lean into your hand. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer who kneels down in the grass and chooses to be present with a small, hurting creature. The systems are simple, yet symbolically they matter. The orphan is no longer alone with its memories. You become a gentle surrogate, a companion who cannot replace what was lost, but can offer warmth in the meantime. As the series matures, Cubone's story begins to feel less like a single frozen tragedy and more like a quiet arc about living with loss. The origin of the skull becomes the opening chapter, not the whole tale. Tonight, we're drifting into a world where grief does not vanish, but learns to walk beside new bonds, where Marowak's ghost becomes a guardian flame, and where the next part of Cubone's myth waits just beyond the edge of the firelight. Designing a wound, how Game Freak builds. Tragedy into a tiny sprite. And if that grief waits just beyond the edge of the firelight, then the first thing you actually see of it is not a line of text, but a tiny, hunched silhouette. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and try to remember Cubone's earliest sprites on that pale Game Boy screen, where every emotion had to live inside a handful of pixels and a suggestion of posture. From the very beginning, Cubone is drawn as if the world is a little too heavy. The body leans forward, shoulders rounded, the head tilted down so the eye holes of the skull never quite meet yours. The bone club is not raised high like a weapon. It is tucked in close, angled toward its chest, as though it is something to hold on to, a comfort object more than a threat. In those first games, there is no sweeping gesture, no grand pose, just a small creature bracing itself against a quiet, invisible weight. As time moves on and the series steps into color, then into smoother lines, that same curve of the spine remains. In gold and silver, in fire red and leaf green, the angle of the skull and the set of the shoulders keep telling the same story, as if Game Freak understood that one of the most powerful ways to show sadness is simply to let a character look down. To this day, when you glance at those sprites, you can almost feel the way Cubone is listening inward, hearing something you cannot. When the world shifts into 3 dimensions, the designers finally give that posture motion, and the myth becomes a walk. In the 3D games, Cubone takes small, tentative steps, its gait just a little shorter than you expect, as though it is testing the ground before trusting it. Sometimes it pauses and adjusts the skull with a tiny movement of its paws, a careful, almost reverent touch that makes the mask feel less like armor and more like a keepsake. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, a child, learning how to move through time and space while carrying something it cannot put down. Look at the proportions and you can see how the tragedy is built right into the design. The skull is large, almost oversized for its body, the eye sockets wide and hollow, the snout stretching out past Cubone's own hidden face. That imbalance creates a sense of vulnerability, a visual reminder that this is a small being living inside someone else's shape. The weight of inherited grief becomes literal. The headpiece is big, the limbs are thin, and the world seems just a bit too large around it. In ancient times, myths were told with masks and costumes, long before written words. Cubone feels like a continuation of that tradition, a tiny masked actor on a digital stage. The minimal visual language, hunched spine, downward gaze, oversized skull, a bone held close, carries as much of the story as any Pokédex entry. Whose skull it is almost becomes secondary to the fact that it is heavy and it is worn, every frame of animation a quiet act of remembrance. Tonight we're drifting into a world where those design choices are not accidents but clues. Because if the skull itself is a mask and the mask is part of the myth, then the next question waiting in the dark is simple and unsettling. What exactly is hiding underneath? Between beta and final, lost concepts that might have changed Cubone. For a moment, hold that question in your hands like a small, quiet stone. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not into horror, but into the gentle, unfinished world that exists before a game is released, when nothing is quite fixed, and even a lonely ground type in Kanto is still only an idea. In ancient times for Pokémon development, long before you saw anything on a screen, there were whole creatures that almost existed, and then simply didn't. Players have uncovered early sketches and beta sprites, the strange, fanged Gorochu that might have stood beside Raichu, the mysterious early designs that later echoed into Scizor, or into the many unused baby forms that never found a home. The world behind the cartridge was fluid, shapes and stories drifting in and out of focus as Game Freak searched for balance. If you imagine Cubone living in that same hazy space, another possibility appears. There could have been a time when its line leaned more openly into the skeletal, when the designers toyed with something closer to a small walking skull spirit than to the round, almost dinosaur-like creature you know. Perhaps early sketches exaggerated the bones of the tail, the hollows of the eyes, or hinted at a more ghostly presence, closer to Ghastly or the later Duskull. In that version, the skull might not be a keepsake at all, but simply its own face. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so you can let that alternate Cubone walk for a while. In that world, its lore might speak less of a mourning child and more of a natural bone-wearing species, like a desert animal that has grown armor from the remains around it. The Pokédex might calmly note that it adorns itself in discarded skulls for protection, a curious habit of nature, not a personal tragedy. The same silhouette, but a different story, and the quiet ache of Lavender Town softened into something more distant. Yet, to this day, you can see how Game Freak often steps back from the darkest edges, not to erase them, but to blur them just enough. The Doomsday Machine in Kalos is framed through AZ's regret, not through graphic detail. Giratina is exiled to a distorted world, not to punish, but to reset the balance between realities. In that pattern, Cubone's finalized lore feels carefully tuned, sad enough to linger in your thoughts, gentle enough to belong in a child's dream. So you are left with a mask whose origin is stated but never diagrammed. The mother is gone, but almost never named as a Marowak in the text itself. The skull fits, yet its exact species shifts like a story told and retold. Tonight we're drifting into the thought that in some early document or sketch, that skull might have been fixed and explicit, and how in that timeline there would be no room for mystery at all. In another world, every Cubone might wear a clearly drawn Marowak skull, the Pokédex, spelling out the lineage in firm, unchanging lines. Comforting in a way because the question would be answered. But something would be lost, the space in your mind where you wonder, the gentle uncertainty that lets Cubone's grief feel both personal and universal at once. As you drift deeper into this quiet myth, the unfinished versions of Cubone fade back into the dark, leaving only the one you know standing in Lavender Town's soft violet light. And from here, the next part of the story waits. Not in what was almost drawn, but in what the released games quietly, consistently chose to say about the mother behind that mask. Children, loss, and gentle stories, why Cubone resonates. So deeply close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, around that little Cubone in the violet hush of Lavender Town. In a world filled with champions and legends, it is such a small figure, and yet its story feels as large and familiar as any myth you've ever carried with you. In ancient times of storytelling, long before Pokeballs and Pokédex entries, children grew up with tales of orphaned heroes. A lost princess in a ruined kingdom, a boy under the stairs, a child sent away in a tiny spacecraft or a wicker basket on a river. Again and again, the story begins with absence. The parents are gone, and in that empty space the listener feels an instant quiet ache. You recognize the unfairness, even as a child, and you lean closer. To this day, so many children's stories open that same door, because loss creates empathy in a single breath. Cubone stands in that tradition, but it also steps gently aside from it. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer who never leaves the edge of town. Cubone does not set out to reclaim a throne, or to prove itself to a distant world. It does not swear revenge on Team Rocket or on fate. It simply looks up at the moon, clutches the bone it carries, and mourns. Its Pokédex entries do not promise glory. They tell you it cries at night, that the skull grows stained with its tears, that it listens for footsteps that will never come. That difference is subtle, but powerful. Where many orphaned protagonists turn their grief into motion, Cubone turns its grief inward, into a quiet, enduring ritual of remembrance. You, as the player, are invited not to cheer for a triumphant return, but to sit beside it in that small circle of sadness, and then to offer companionship. In a game often remembered for gyms and leagues, Cubone's story is about staying, not going. Tonight, we're drifting into the way that makes Cubone especially important for younger players. For many children, this may be the first time a game whispers so directly about death, yet it does so inside a gentle world where partners walk at your side, where even a ghost Marowak can find peace and move on. Death is present, but it is framed within bonds, within the idea that love lingers as memory, that the living can help the lost find rest, not to punish, but to reset the balance of a hurt place. And then there is the skull itself, and the mother whose name the games almost never speak. The entries say it's mother, but rarely it's Marowak. The shape of the skull can differ, the origin remains uncertain, and in that quiet gap, something very human happens. You project. You might imagine a specific Pokémon, or a face you once knew, or simply a feeling you cannot quite name. Because the story does not close every door, it allows your own experiences to slip gently inside, making Cubone's sorrow feel strangely personal, as if, under that mask, it is mourning something you understand. From there, another question waits in the dark. If the games are so careful with what they say about Cubone's mother, what are they choosing, very deliberately, not to say? The skull as mask, identity, protection, and hiding the self. If the games are careful about what they do not say, they are just as careful about what they never show. To this day, the Pokédex repeats a quiet, almost whispered detail. No one has ever seen Cubone's true face. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and that simple line becomes heavier than any statistics or move list, because it turns the skull from a mere object into a kind of sacred mask. In that image, Cubone is not simply carrying a relic, it is living inside it. The skull is a room, a shelter, a small private world made from the last thing its mother ever gave. When the entries tell you it cries at night, gazing at the moon that reminds it of her, you can almost imagine the sound echoing softly inside that bone, held close, contained, so the rest of the world will not have to hear. The mask keeps the tears from spilling out too far. Tonight we're drifting into the idea that this is more than devotion. Wearing the mother's skull is an act of love, yes, but it is also a way to turn away from every curious stare. If no one can see your face, then no one can fully see your grief. The skull becomes permission to look down, to look inward, to move through time and space half hidden, so that the ache in Cubone's chest can remain its own, not a spectacle for others to study. In that sense, the skull is both armor and altar. It protects, and it remembers. In ancient times, people carved masks for ceremonies, painted war paint before leaving home, or wore charms over their hearts, not only to ward off danger, but to reshape who they were allowed to be for a little while. In our quieter modern world, the masks look different. Yet the myth is the same. A child might disappear into a game, an adult into work, a lonely person into a hobby that fills every spare moment, each one a gentle disguise that says, "Look at this role, not at the hurt beneath it." This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer who recognizes those disguises. You may have your own skulls, though they are not made of bone, a carefully curated online self, a practiced joke, a calm voice you put on when you feel anything but calm. Like Cubone, you move through the world with a part of yourself carefully covered, balancing the need to be seen with the need to stay safe. And so the mystery of Cubone's hidden face begins to echo the mystery of its origin. The games never lift the mask, never describe the features underneath, just as they never fully name the species of the mother whose skull it wears. Some questions remain unanswered, not to punish, but to reset the gaze, to remind you that the deepest wounds are allowed to stay private. Yet in that privacy, another, quieter question waits. If the mask is never removed, what truths might be hiding in the shadows it casts over Cubone's past? From child to warrior, the quiet alchemy of becoming Marowak. If the mask never lifts, then the only way forward is to watch how the one who wears it begins to move. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not backward into Cubone's first loss, but forward into the quiet, uncertain path that leads toward Marowak. In the Pokédex, that path is written less as a change in shape and more as a change in spirit. Cubone is described as crying every night, its tears staining the skull, its wails echoing in lonely places like Lavender Town. It is small, openly grieving, a child that the world can hear. Marowak, by contrast, is almost always described as hardened, stoic, even vengeful. To this day, entries speak of a Pokémon that has overcome its sorrow, that has grown tough and unyielding, that brandishes its bone with grim resolve. Where Cubone sobs, Marowak stands in silence. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer who has been asked to grow up too soon. Tonight, we're drifting into that space between child and guardian, where evolution feels less like a sudden flash of light and more like a long, dim corridor. You can imagine Cubone's nights stretching on, each one a small ritual of remembrance, until the crying slowly fades. not because the love is gone, but because the grief has learned to sit more quietly in its chest. In ancient times, people marked adulthood with ceremonies, masks, and symbols carried in the hand. For Cubone, evolution into Marowak feels like a similar rite written into nature itself. Over time, the same bone it once clutched for comfort, like a child holding a blanket, begins to move differently. The Pokédex tells you that Marowak hones its bone into a club, that it can hurl it with precision, that it dances with it in Alola's firelit nights. A soft object of solace becomes a tool, and then a weapon, and finally a kind of staff, guiding its movements and its purpose. You can see the contrast as a kind of quiet alchemy. The tears that once fell onto the skull become, in a sense, lacquer, hardening into a shell of composure. The fear that once made Cubone curl inward becomes, in Marowak, a watchful, protective stance. It no longer cries for the one it lost. Instead, it stands between danger and those who might one day feel the same loss. Understanding Cubone's origin means accepting that its story does not end with a grave or a tower, but with this transformation. The skull upon its head, once only a reminder of absence, becomes a badge of survival, a visible sign that it has carried its sorrow through time and out the other side. The world still sees the same bone, the same hollow eyes, yet the presence behind them has changed. And in that change waits another question, as soft as sleep. If the journey from Cubone to Marowak is a ritual of grief, turn to guardianship, what kind of world shaped a species that must learn this lesson so early? Lavender's shadow, Kanto's silence. Why other regions look away? So now, as you picture that small figure standing a little straighter beneath its skull, let your awareness drift outward, away from one Cubone and into the world that taught it to grieve so young. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to grand arenas or cheering crowds, but to a single, quiet town where this sorrow was given a shape, a name, and a ghost. In Kanto, that place is Lavender Town, a cluster of modest houses, a gentle, unsettling music that seems to hang in the air, and at its center, the Pokémon Tower, reaching up like a stone candle into the mist. It is here, and only here, that the story of Cubone's mother is drawn as clearly as ink on paper. A Marowak, slain while protecting her child, her spirit lingering as a restless silhouette on the staircase. The old games show you that presence in a way that feels almost like a myth told around a lantern, and they tie it to Team Rocket's cruelty, to the idea that grief can echo so strongly it refuses to fade. To this day, when people think of Cubone's sadness, they almost always think of Lavender Town. Yet when you wander beyond Kanto into Johto's gentle towers, Hoenn's wild roots, Sinnoh's ancient snow, the story changes its tone. The Pokédex still speaks of Cubone crying at night, of tears that mark its skull, of a longing for a lost mother, but it rarely recreates that full lavender scenario. There is no second Pokémon Tower in Unova, no repeating ghostly Marowak in Kalos. The same sorrow is there, but the stage is different, quieter, almost as if that one tragedy belongs to a single place and time. In-world, you can imagine people speaking of lavender the way they might speak of an old disaster, or of a temple where something sacred and sad once happened. In ancient times, stories like that would travel slowly, becoming legends rather than rules. The events at Pokémon Tower feel like that, a singular wound in history, a story of one Cubone and one Marowak whose paths crossed with human cruelty. Other Cubone in other regions may lose their parents to age, to illness, to the soft, inevitable turning of time. Their mourning is no less real, but it does not rise up into a tower of ghosts. This regional silence suggests something important. If only Lavender speaks so clearly of a Marowak mother, then perhaps that ghost is a poignant exception, not a binding pattern. The skull each Cubone wears may not always match that same shape. The parent beneath it may not always have been a Marowak at all. Tonight we're drifting into the idea that Cubone's myth is broader than one staircase and one spirit, and that somewhere, beyond Kanto's fog, other origins wait in the dark, just out of sight, ready to be remembered next. Player as witness, how our presence changes. Cubone's story, and then into that wider darkness you arrive. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to Lavender Town, to that muted music and the pale, vertical lines of the Pokémon Tower. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer moving slowly up each floor, past mediums in trance and restless spirits that drift in and out of view. On one level, a Cubone waits, small and shaken, its grief echoing the larger, unseen story above. Higher still, the Marowak ghost blocks the staircase, bound to the world by one last memory. You do not drive it away with anger. You simply stand there, offer presence, and let the sylph scope reveal its true form. In that quiet moment, when the spirit recognizes that its child is no longer alone, it softens, and the Pokédex's tragedy becomes something else, not an endless loop of loss, but a crossing. To this day, players remember that scene as if you personally helped lay a parent to rest. And in doing so, you gently nudged the course of that family's story back toward balance. From there, Cubone is no longer just a line in an entry about tears staining a skull. When you catch one on the tower's lower floors, or later on the rocky roots beyond, it can feel less like capturing a creature and more like adopting an orphan the world forgot. You see those big, hollow eye sockets, the way it holds its bone like a comfort object, and something in you volunteers for a quiet responsibility. You carry it through time and space into new regions and new nights, letting its grief walk beside your own unspoken memories. Nicknaming becomes a small act of healing. Instead of Cubone, you might call it Hope or Echo, or a name that only you understand, tying its myth to your own life. In later games, when you groom your partners, feed them in camp, or watch them doze by the fire, the skull stops being merely a relic of an ancient loss. It becomes part of a shared present, a familiar silhouette bobbing at your side whenever you turn, a reminder that even old sorrow can live gently in the light of companionship. Tonight, we're drifting into the idea that this is where Cubone's origin quietly changes. Because your journey is different from anyone else's, the unseen mother beneath that skull shifts too. Maybe, in your mind, she was a Marowak from that tower, or a Kangaskhan separated in the chaos of nature, or some other species that once watched the stars with her child. The games leave the details unresolved, not to punish, but to reset the story in every new save file, so that each time you meet a Cubone, you write another version of the myth simply by walking beside it, step after gentle step, into whatever tale comes next. Softening the edges. How adaptations handle Cubone's pain. And when you step from the quiet, looping text of the Pokédex into the moving images of the anime, you can feel the story shift just a little toward healing. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that first journey through Lavender Town on a television screen instead of a Game Boy, where the ghost Marowak is still present, still protective, still a mother standing between her child and harm. In the games, her departure is final. In the show, she lingers, her spirit appears, comforts Cubone, and then rises in a soft glow, as if the world itself is promising that love can cross the spaces between life and death. The separation is still real, but the anime leans gently toward reunion and closure, letting you see Cubone look up, not just at a skull, but at a presence that answers back. To this day, that scene is remembered less as a tale of loss and more as a quiet assurance that bonds endure. Later episodes return to Cubone and Marowak with the same careful touch. A lonely Cubone in a tournament arc is given companions and a place to belong. A Marowak in Alola becomes a partner, a guardian, hinting that this line is not defined only by sorrow, but by the way grief can be carried forward into new forms of courage. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer watching small acts of comfort ripple outward through the world. The manga, though, often walks closer to the edge of the original myth. In ancient times of this franchise's publication history, the Pokémon Adventures series showed a Marowak's death with more direct weight, letting the panels linger on Cubone's reaction, its tears, the way the skull becomes less a symbol and more a visible wound. Some chapters even complicate the question of identity, suggesting that not every Cubone shares the same past, that some mothers are seen, some are unnamed, and some are only implied in half-told backstories. By leaning into darker or more dramatic storytelling, the manga clarifies one truth while blurring another. The emotional reality is sharpened, but whether that mother is always a Marowak or sometimes another species entirely is left in a kind of narrative twilight. The myth is explored, not solved. Spin-off worlds soften the edges in a different way. In Mystery Dungeon, when you can choose to be a Cubone, its sadness becomes a starting point rather than an ending. You wake in a strange land with no clear memory, and instead of dwelling on the skull, the story offers you a partner, a village, and quests that turn grief into motion. Mobile titles and side games echo this pattern, using Cubone's melancholy as a character trait, then balancing it with friendship, adventure, and the gentle rhythm of daily tasks. Across all these mediums, you can feel a quiet decision being made. The creators seem less concerned with proving exactly which species gave that final gift of bone, and more devoted to the emotional truth underneath, that loss leaves shapes we carry, that remembrance is a kind of armor, and that companionship can grow even in the shadow of absence. Tonight, we're drifting into a version of Cubone's story where the question is no longer who was the mother, but something far more unsettling and unexpectedly hopeful about what that skull might really mean when you look at it from the inside. A skull shared by many collective myths in the Pokémon world. And once you look at it from the inside, you begin to notice something quietly unsettling about the world around Cubone. No one seems to agree on what exactly that skull is. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to Kanto, to the soft electronic chime of Lavender Town's music drifting through the old tower. In that region, people speak with a kind of hushed certainty. To this day, if you asked a storyteller in a Kanto Pokémon Center where Cubone's skull comes from, they would answer without hesitation. It is the skull of its Marowak mother. They would point to the one great tragedy they all remember, the ghost that once stood between Team Rocket and the restless spirits, and they would say that Lavender Tower proved the rule. One Marowak, one child, and suddenly every skull became the same story, passed down as local wisdom. But this isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. So you drift gently to another part of the world where the myths grew in different soil. In some distant, dust-colored village, perhaps in a region that loves ground-type Pokémon the way Sinnoh once loved its ancient legends, the elders might tell you something else entirely. There, the Cubone huddling by the fire is said to wear the skull of any mother who loved the earth, a sand slash, a Donphan, even a Nidoking's long-lost mate. In another town, even farther away, an old woman might lean in and whisper that the skull is not a skull at all, but a mask that condenses from grief itself, forming the way a pearl forms around a grain of sand, shaped by tears, not by bone. In ancient times, stories like this were how people made sense of nature, of time, of loss. One strange event would happen in a quiet corner of the world, and over years it would become a pattern, then a rule, then a myth that children repeated before sleep without remembering who first spoke it aloud. Lavender Town's Marowak becomes the template. The Pokédex line about a dead mother becomes the chorus. A traveler repeats it in Johto, a researcher writes it down in Hoenn, and soon even those who never climbed the tower speak as if they had stood beside that lonely Cubone themselves. Tonight we're drifting into a space where your own world and the Pokémon world begin to mirror one another. Outside the games, fans trade theories like charms. Cubone as a lost Kangaskhan child, Cubone as a baby Marowak, Cubone as an orphan of any species. Inside the games, you can almost imagine the same gentle disagreements around campfires and classroom desks. The multiplicity of our explanations becomes the multiplicity of theirs, until Cubone's skull is less a single answer and more a shared, flickering campfire tale that burns quietly across both worlds, inviting you to listen for the next version. And somewhere beyond those fires, another possibility waits, stranger and more intimate than all the rest. Not a Marowak, after all? Preparing to unveil an alternate origin. And so we leave those campfire stories behind us for a moment, their sparks still glowing at the edge of your mind, and turn towards something a little clearer, a little more grounded. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not into wild contradiction, but into a quiet place where the different versions begin to settle, like snowflakes choosing where to rest. Up to now, you've walked through several paths at once. You've traced the familiar assumption that Cubone is simply a baby Marowak, its tragedy neatly contained within a single family line. You've noticed the Pokédex entries that speak of a dead mother's skull and endless tears, yet so often leave the mother's actual species unnamed, as if the world itself were choosing to remain politely vague. You've entertained the gentler idea that Cubone might be an orphan of almost any species, adopting a skull the way a child might cling to a keepsake, and you've lingered with the symbolism of that skull, not as a horror, but as a small, stubborn monument to love and memory. To this day, most people carry Lavender Town in their hearts as the answer. In that quiet tower, there is a single Marowak whose spirit refuses to move on until its child is safe. And the story is so strong that it seems to explain every Cubone everywhere. The image of that lone ghost, standing between its child and cruelty, is so powerful that it casts a long shadow across the entire myth. It feels complete. It feels enough. But sometimes when a story feels that complete, it can gently eclipse other truths. The Marowak of Lavender Town may be a mother to one Cubone or a few, yet the world is wide and Cubone appears in places far from that tower, in regions that have never heard the echo of that ghostly cry. The grief in the Pokédex is constant, but the link to Marowak is not always spoken aloud. It's as if the games themselves bow their heads and then step back, refusing to write the final word. Tonight we're drifting into that space the text leaves empty. Not to erase the Marowak, you remember, but to ask very softly, what happens if we stop assuming she is the only possible mother? When you look past the story you were told first, other patterns begin to emerge. Little design echoes, evolutionary lines that almost connect but not quite, skull shapes that seem to shift from entry to entry, as though they once belonged to someone else entirely. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, following details instead of gym badges. By tracing silhouettes, comparing sprites, and listening to how later generations reframe Cubone's sorrow as a source of strange, ritual strength, a different picture slowly comes into focus, one that reaches backward into an older, almost ancient origin. In the next part of our story, we'll follow that faint trail, not to punish, but to reset the way we think about Cubone's beginnings, moving from drifting possibilities toward a more defined, if still gentle conclusion, where the mother, under the skull, is not a Marowak at all. Gathering the threads, what we've learned about Cubone's sorrow. So before we follow that trail any further, it may help to pause, to look back over the world we've walked through together, and to see how the threads have quietly woven themselves into a single, gentle pattern. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, not forward into answers, but backward through the stories we've already shared. From the very beginning, the foundation has been strangely consistent. Across region after region, Pokédex entries return to the same quiet image, a small Pokémon alone at night, wearing a skull that once belonged to its mother. It gazes at the moon, it cries softly when it remembers, and the sound echoes in the dark like a lullaby turned inside out. To this day, the games rarely tell you what species that mother was. They simply repeat that she is gone and that Cubone's tears never fully dry. Around that simple sentence, Lavender Town rose up like an emotional landmark. There, the story narrowed from all Cubone to one Cubone, from a mythic pattern to a single child. You met the restless Marowak spirit standing between Team Rocket's cruelty and the tower it once called home, and you saw the outline of a family broken in a moment of needless harm. In that quiet grey town, the abstract Pokédex line about a deceased mother suddenly had a face, a name, and a place to rest. From there, different theories began to bloom, each one trying to answer the same aching question: who exactly was Cubone's mother? Some players assumed, almost without thinking, that it must always have been a Marowak, that every skull matched the evolution line in a clean, orderly way. Others looked at shapes and sprites and saw an echo of Kangaskhan, imagining a hidden link between the baby in the pouch and the lonely child in the skull. Some stories softened the edges by calling Cubone a baby Marowak, as if grief were just a stage on the way to adulthood. Others opened the door wider and suggested that Cubone might be an orphan of almost any species, that the skull could change from one individual to the next, and that the real constant was not biology, but loss. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and along the way the focus gently slipped from solving a puzzle to understanding a feeling. In that light, the title's quiet insistence that it wasn't a Marowak was never meant as a harsh denial, but as an invitation. By loosening our grip on one rigid story, we made space for other possibilities to breathe, for design details, early sprites, and careful flavor text to speak. Together, they painted Cubone less as a creature with a single sad origin, and more as a symbol of grief itself, moving through time, through regions, through different ways that people and Pokémon remember their dead. Tonight, we're drifting into a softer place where the question of who begins to give way to how and why. How did this myth take shape, and why did the creators choose this particular child to carry so much sorrow? As we move on, the path ahead will be less about uncovering a hidden species and more about resting in the emotional landscape we've crossed, letting the story settle around you like quiet, ancient air. Beyond Marowak. Why the mother might never have been one species. From here, you can almost feel the story loosening its grip on strict labels, and that is where Cubone's myth becomes clearest. The more you look, the more it seems that the mother in its lore was never meant to be a single, neatly filed Marowak at all, but a gentle placeholder for any lost caregiver, any vanished presence that once kept the world in balance for a small, lonely child. Close your eyes and let your mind wander. In the games themselves, you are only ever shown one Cubone whose mother is confirmed, beyond doubt, to be a Marowak. The restless spirit in Lavender Town's tower blocking the stairs until it is calmed and allowed to sleep. That story is sharp and specific, like a gravestone with a name carved into it. Yet every other Cubone you meet is described in broad, drifting language, as if the Pokédex is talking about an archetype, not a family tree. To this day, most entries simply say that Cubone wears its dead mother's skull and cry under the moon, and that the skull's shape may differ from one individual to another. They rarely say Marowak. They do not catalogue bones by species or measure them like fossils. Instead, they speak in feelings and images, the tear-stained bone, the quiet child, the echo of a voice it can no longer hear. The lore keeps stepping back from anatomy and into emotion. From that distance, the orphan of any species idea begins to feel less like a wild theory and more like a natural reading of the text. If the skull can look different, if only one in-game story ever pins the mother down as Marowak, then perhaps Cubone is not a baby Marowak at all, but a Pokémon that takes in the remains of whatever guardian it has lost. Sometimes that may be a Marowak, sometimes something else, sometimes maybe just the memory of a shape. In ancient times, storytellers used figures like this all the time. The orphan in a folktale is not a historically precise child with a birth certificate. They are every child who has ever felt alone. The wanderer is every person who has ever lost their way. Cubone, with its skull and its soft, hidden face, stands in that same mythic space, less a zoological specimen, more a living symbol of absence. Later, Pokédex entries and spin-off stories lean into this even more. They deepen the mood, describing the way Cubone's grief becomes a quiet strength, or how Alolan Marowak dance with flames not to punish, but to reset the living's relationship with the dead. The focus drifts toward ritual, toward the way nature and memory intertwine, and away from strict biological charts. Insisting that it must be Marowak narrows all of this into a technical answer, like closing a book the moment the mystery becomes interesting. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. And the text itself seems to resist being pinned down, as if answering too precisely would make the story smaller. Tonight, we're drifting into a gentler possibility. That Cubone's mother is intentionally many things at once, sometimes Marowak, sometimes another lost guardian, and sometimes nothing you can name at all, only the soft outline of loss. From here, we can begin to ask not who lies beneath the skull, but how a whole world chose this one small Pokémon to carry so much of its grief. The gentle power of not knowing, mystery as comfort. And when you sit with that question for a moment, you may notice something gentle hiding inside it. After all this wandering through Pokédex lines and tower myths, there is still no single canon-locked answer. No final reveal. No official unmasking. And instead of feeling frustrating, it can feel strangely peaceful, like realizing you do not have to stay awake to solve a puzzle tonight. Close your eyes and let your mind wander. Think about how many bedtime stories you heard in childhood that ended not with a tidy explanation, but with a soft, lingering maybe. The traveler who never quite reaches the shining city. The guardian spirit whose name no one remembers. In ancient times, myths were allowed to trail off at the edges, leaving a quiet space where the listener's own dream could continue the story after sleep had already arrived. Cubone's missing mother belongs to that same tradition. To this day, the games whisper around her without ever quite stepping into the light. One Pokédex entry tells you Cubone cries to the moon for its lost parent. Another mentions that the skull's shape can differ, hinting that not every story is the same. Lavender Town gives you a single Marowak, whose end you can witness, but all the other Cubone in the world simply are. Their grief is real, but its origin is left just out of reach. This mirrors something very human. When you were small, there were losses and changes that the adults around you could not fully explain or chose to soften with simpler words. A pet that went away, a grandparent who went to sleep, a move to a new town described as an adventure rather than an uprooting. The why was incomplete, but the feeling was clear. The story was shaped to protect your heart, not to satisfy every question. The Pokémon world does this too. NPCs in Lavender Town speak in half-understood phrases. Rumors of Team Rocket, a restless spirit, a tower built for morning. They do not lay out a perfect chain of cause and effect. Life in Kanto goes on, children trade Pokémon, nature cycles through sun and rain, and somewhere a Cubone still gazes up at the sky through the empty eye sockets of its borrowed mask. The mystery hums quietly underneath, like distant music you can't quite make out. Because Cubone's mother is never fully defined, every player brings their own secret story into that empty space. For some, she is a brave Marowak who stood between her child and harm. For others, she is an unnamed creature from far away, or even a memory of someone in their own life who vanished before they could say goodbye. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing their own feelings across a small, pixelated silhouette. In a late-night world, that openness is a kind of relief. There is no pressure to catalogue every detail, no demand that you decide once and for all what lies beneath the skull. You are allowed simply to sit with Cubone's quiet shape, the curve of the bone, the way its story holds both sorrow and comfort in fragile balance, like watching distant stars whose names you do not know and do not need to know. So perhaps Cubone's mystery is not a locked door, but a gentle room left unlit, where questions can curl up and rest beside you. You do not have to open it. You only have to know it is there, waiting, patient, part of the world's soft unknown. And as we follow that darkness a little further, the next story will ask something even quieter. What happens when a whole region decides to honor grief instead of hiding it away? From tragedy to tenderness, how players became Cubone's caretakers. Lavender Town shows you a tower of mourning, but something much softer happens the first time you read Cubone's Pokédex entry and really let it sink in. Without being told to, you may notice your hands change how they move. You stop treating Cubone as a tool for progress and start treating it as someone you are quietly responsible for. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, back to that early playthrough. Perhaps you caught a Cubone in the wild or met one in the Pokémon Tower, and from the instant you learned that it wears its dead mother's skull, a strange protectiveness settled in. Players talk about refusing to let Cubone faint, keeping it in their party long after stronger options appear, or imagining, in a way the game never states, that they have become its new family. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, carrying a small, grieving creature through a bright, pixelated world. From there, the fandom quietly takes over, where the game leaves off. To this day, fan art shows Cubone asleep against a trainer's leg, the skull tipped back just enough to hint at a smile, or being gently groomed by a Kangaskhan, a Marowak, even a Sylveon, as if grief has opened a doorway into a wider, found family. In fanfiction, Cubone learns to listen to music again, to play with other Pokémon, to decorate its mother's bone with flowers. Headcanons imagine rituals where trainers visit the tower each year with their Cubone, not to reopen the wound, but to honor the time that has passed and the new bonds that have formed. This mirrors the quiet structure of Lavender Town itself. The game asks you to help Cubone's mother find peace, to calm a restless spirit and restore balance to a haunted place, and then, very deliberately, it looks away. Cubone's life after that moment is implied, not shown, left in a gentle, narrative silence. The screen does not follow Cubone home, it trusts you to imagine what home might look like. In that space, a different answer to the mystery appears. The important question is no longer who Cubone's mother was or what species she might have been, but who chooses to stay with Cubone afterward. The player, the trainer, you, become a kind of adoptive guardian, not through any formal title, but through the simple decision to keep Cubone close, to level it slowly, to notice when its story hurts, and to offer, in response, companionship. In ancient times within this series' own myth, grief belongs to kings like AZ, to immortal wanderers and legendary Pokémon who reshape nature itself. With Cubone, that vast cosmic theme is placed gently into a small, ordinary body, and the work of healing is slow, non-linear, and shared. Children's stories often begin in sadness and then move, step by small step, toward resilience and connection. Cubone walks that path at your side, at whatever pace you allow. So each time someone chooses Cubone for their team, pauses over its lore, or draws it a little softer than the official art, they participate in a small, ongoing act of kindness toward a fictional creature who cannot know them, yet somehow feels known. And as you listen now, in the quiet of this night, your attention is its own form of care. Care for Cubone, yes, but also for the parts of yourself that understand loss and long for comfort. Tonight we're drifting into that shared, tender space where taking a story seriously becomes a way of taking your own feelings seriously too, and where the next tale of morning will open like a lantern in the dark, waiting to be held with the same gentle hands. Game Freak's quiet experiment, writing grief into a world of battles. In a world of bright colors and cheerful music, Cubone's quiet sorrow feels almost like a secret door the games are inviting you to open very slowly. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, pausing in the middle of a children's story to notice that one small creature is standing apart, looking up at the moon and crying for someone who will never come back. From the very beginning, Cubone is unusual. While most Pokédex entries talk about strength, habitat, or curious powers, Cubone's entries return again and again to the same image. A small Pokémon wearing its dead mother's skull, its tears staining the bone, its cries echoing each night. In a series where defeat usually means fainting and trying again, Cubone quietly says that sometimes someone is gone and there is no reset. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to Lavender Town, where that idea first crystallizes into a place. The music there is slow and uneasy, a thin, trembling melody that seems to hang in the air like fog. Ghost Pokémon drift through the tower, each with their own eerie stories. Spirits that lure travelers, phantoms born from discarded masks, beings that feed on dreams. And at the center of it all, a single Marowak's restless spirit, standing between Cubone and the people who harmed it, turning a game about collecting companions into a quiet myth about protection, loss, and letting go. Cubone is part of a pattern you can feel if you move gently through the series. There is the abandoned Eve in Celadon, left behind by a trainer who changed their mind. There are tales of polluted rivers and forests choked by factories, where Pokémon suffer when nature is pushed out of balance. To this day, the games rarely dwell on these stories, but they are there, like small, folded notes tucked between pages. Flavor text is where Game Freak hides its bravest experiments. A few optional lines, only seen if you choose to look, become a safe space for darker or more complex themes. You can read about Cubone's nightly mourning, or you can simply travel on. The story never forces you. In that choice, the games respect the player's own readiness, allowing grief to be present without demanding that it fill the whole screen. Over time, Cubone's lore has shifted like moonlight on stone. Later generations soften the edges, hinting that its sorrow can become strength, that rituals of mourning, like Alolan Marowak's ghostly dances, can turn pain into a kind of cultural memory. Other entries lean back into the sadness, reminding you that the skull is not a symbol, but a body, and that each Cubone's mask is shaped a little differently, as if to quietly admit that not every mother was the same species or the same story. That ambiguity is a kind of kindness. By never fully explaining who the mother was or how every Cubone came to be alone, the games draw a line. Enough detail to feel real, not so much that it becomes crushing. In that in-between space, you are practicing something very human, sitting with difficult feelings in a safe, fictional setting, learning that sorrow can share space with adventure and friendship. Tonight, we're drifting into that understanding more deeply, as the next piece of Cubone's myth invites you to look under the skull and wonder what Game Freak chose not to say and why. Why Cubone stays with us: grief, childhood, and quiet resonance. When you think about why Cubone lingers in your memory, it often begins with when you first met it. You were probably young, moving through this pixelated world where most things were bright and simple, and then quietly, the story of a small creature who misses its mother appeared between item descriptions and move names, and something in you shifted. At that age, ideas of loss, separation, or change are still forming, like soft clay. You might not have known grief in your own life, not in a way you could name, but the game placed this gentle, lonely figure in front of you and simply said, "It cries at night for someone who is gone." No elaborate cutscene, no dramatic speech, just a line or two in a Pokédex entry and the image of a child in a skull-shaped helmet looking down. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment to that simplicity. In a world of legendary myths about time and space, gods of oceans and forests, Cubone's story is almost painfully small. It is not about saving nature or restoring balance. It is about one little life and an absence, because the concept is so clear, a small creature who misses its mother. The emotion is accessible even if your own life then had been mostly safe and whole. The skull it wears becomes more than a strange design choice. It is both shield and weight, protection and burden. To this day, the image feels like an echo of how people carry memories. Close to the mind, always there, sometimes comforting, sometimes aching. The skull keeps Cubone safe, but it also keeps the loss close, pressed against its face, the way you might press an old photograph to your chest and feel both warmth and pain. As time moves on and you return to these games as an adult, the text has not changed, but you have. Now when you read that Cubone cries looking at the moon, or that its tears stain the skull, those words pass through more crowded rooms inside you. Experiences of your own, goodbyes, moves, endings that arrive too soon, suddenly sit beside this quiet Pokémon, and the same few sentences feel deeper, almost startlingly so. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer revisiting an ancient, familiar road. Cubone's body is small, almost cute, its posture a little hunched, its tail stubby and unthreatening, yet its lore is unexpectedly heavy. That contrast imprints itself in your mind long after you forget exact team compositions or puzzle solutions. It becomes one of those emotional landmarks in the Pokémon world, a point you remember not for what you could do there, but for how the story made you feel. Tonight we're drifting into that feeling as we follow your own memory back to Lavender Town. The first time the music felt strangely hollow and distant, the first time a Pokédex entry made you pause. Those moments still echo softly now, like a tone held in the background of your sleep, as we turn toward what the games hint about the mother behind the skull, and what they very carefully never say. Your version of the story, inviting your own Cubone canon. And in that quiet space between what is said and what is left unsaid, something gentle opens up for you. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to the official answers, but to the soft places in between them. Within the careful boundaries of canon, there is more room than it first appears. The Pokédex tells a simple, aching story. A small Pokémon wearing its dead mother's skull, crying to the moon. It almost never tells you who that mother was. That absence is not a mistake. It is an invitation. Tonight, we're drifting into that invitation as a kind of personal myth. If, to this day, it comforts you to imagine Cubone as the child of the Marowak in Lavender Tower, you can keep that story without apology. If the old Kangaskhan theory feels more meaningful, if you like the idea of a lost baby from that ancient line, you can hold that instead. Or perhaps, in your world, Cubone's parent is unnamed, unseen, maybe not even a species we know, just a presence that once held it close. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so you do not need proof or permission. You only need to notice which version lets your shoulders drop, which version makes the world of Pokémon feel kinder, more in balance with your own memories. No one can look into your save file and correct the quiet story you tell yourself as you walk through Lavender's pale corridors. You might imagine a Cubone who is found early by a gentle trainer, someone who understands that the skull is not a costume, but a small, portable gravestone. In your mind, maybe that trainer visits the tower with Cubone each year, lighting imaginary incense in the dim, purple light. Or there could be a Cubone who wanders the grass and meets another orphaned Pokémon, perhaps a lonely Charmander whose flame once nearly went out, and they keep each other company when the night music turns soft and low. There is room, too, for a future you will never see on screen. A Cubone who grows very slowly into a Marowak that one day chooses a hill at sunset, takes off the skull, and lays it carefully in the earth. No dramatic moment, no audience. Just nature, time, and a quiet farewell. When you carry a story like that, it changes how you move through the game. Maybe you always keep Cubone on your team, giving it a place to rest between encounters. Maybe you find yourself visiting Lavender Town more often than you need to, circling the tower as if paying respects. Even when nothing is happening on the screen, you might imagine small scenes in the empty spaces. Cubone sitting by a campfire, tracing the cracks in its skull with one claw, listening to the wind. In this way, it wasn't a Marowak becomes less a closed door and more like a path branching out into the dark, an opening for you to decide what feels right. Long-running worlds like Pokémon become a kind of home because of this. Shared myths on the surface, private meanings underneath, where your own experiences and griefs and comforts quietly settle. As you drift towards sleep, you are not being asked to solve Cubone's mystery, only to notice which version of its story rests most gently in your chest, because in a moment we'll follow that feeling back into the tower itself and listen more closely to what the games have hidden in its shadows. Carrying the skull, carrying the story. What we take with us. So we return to that small, persistent image, Cubone on a quiet hill, the world dim around it, looking up at the moon. The bone is held close against its chest, like a child with a favorite toy, and the skull rests heavily over its head, turning its face into a gentle, permanent mask. The night is still. The only movement is the rise and fall of its breathing and the slow drift of clouds across the sky. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that scene for a moment. The skull is weighty, almost too large for such a small body, and yet Cubone has learned to walk with it, to sleep with it, to dream under it. It is a burden, yes, but also a kind of shelter. In the game's myth, it is the skull of a mother. In the quiet of your own thoughts, it can become something wider, the shape of memory itself. Memory can feel like that, something you never quite take off. It presses down, it changes how the world sounds, but it also keeps you safe, reminding you where you have been, who you have loved, and how far you have already come through time and space. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, one who walks through their own inner landscape with old stories resting gently on their shoulders. Fictional stories live there too. A small sprite on a Game Boy screen, a line in a Pokédex about a lonely Pokémon crying to the moon, a Lavender Town melody that felt strangely sad when you were younger. All of that settles inside you. To this day, Cubone might rise up in your thoughts at odd, quiet moments, not because you are playing, but because some part of its story found a place to stay. It is okay that the story is a little sad. Some myths are like that, not to punish, but to reset something in us, to clear a space where we can feel understood. When you think of Cubone, you might not feel sharp grief, only a soft, reflective ache, the sense of being quietly seen in your own small losses and changes. Tonight we're drifting into that feeling together. Revisiting Cubone's lore might have stirred old memories, or it might simply have wrapped you in a calm, wistful mood, the way a familiar song at night can. Either way is welcome. There is no correct response, only whatever gently rises to the surface. If you like, you can notice what you are carrying right now, not to analyze or explain, but just to acknowledge it, the way Cubone acknowledges its skull by holding the bone a little tighter. Your experiences, your joys and sorrows and half-forgotten days are part of the shape of you, as natural as the curve of the moon above that little Pokemon's head. In a moment, we'll step back into the tower's shadowed corridors, but we will carry this image with us, the skull as memory, the hill as your inner world, so that as the story of Cubone grows quieter, your own thoughts can begin to lean toward rest. From Lavender Town to your pillow. A soft call to rest. So now for a moment let the tower itself grow softer in your mind, its hard edges rounding out like a memory seen through half-closed eyes. Lavender Town is no longer a place of fear, but a small, quiet hilltop town at night, its windows dimmed, its streets mostly empty, the Pokémon Tower standing above it all like a gentle guardian keeping watch over sleeping souls. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine that you are there, just beyond the last stair of the tower. Behind you, Cubone's mother has finally found peace. The restless presence that once lingered in those rooms has grown calm and clear, like incense smoke fading into the rafters. The door closes with a soft click, not to punish, but to reset this little corner of the world back into stillness. You step out into the cool night air, and the difference is immediate. Inside, there were chants and chimes and the faint echo of sorrow. Outside, there is only the quiet of a town that has put away its worries for the night. The sky above Lavender is deep and velvety, the stars scattered like tiny lanterns. Somewhere far below, waves meet the shore with a slow, steady rhythm that feels older than any myth. As you begin to walk, your footsteps sound gentle against the cobblestones, each one a soft tap that fades almost as soon as it appears. The wind moves through the grass on the hillside, carrying a hint of salt and earth, and in the distance you can almost hear the Lavender Town theme reduced to a few simple notes, as if the song itself is getting sleepy, humming only the parts it can remember. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. The lore has been opened up and explored. The questions about Cubone's skull, its mother, its grief, have all been aired out like old letters laid across a table. For tonight, there is nothing left that needs solving. The mysteries can stay mysteries, resting in the quiet space between one thought and the next. So you let your mind loosen its careful grip on details and theories, the way fingers slowly relax after holding something precious for a long time. Tonight, we're drifting into a different kind of attention, one that doesn't analyze, but simply notices. The way the fog settles low over the rooftops, the way lantern light blurs at the edges, the way your own breathing finds a slower, steadier balance. To this day, Cubone's story remains the same no matter how long you leave it alone. It will be there tomorrow, unchanged and waiting, like a little Pokémon setting down its bone at its bedside, curling around it and closing its eyes. You can set it down too. With each step away from the tower, the imagery can grow simpler, the colors softer, until all that remains is a small town, a quiet road, and the feeling that it is finally time to rest. Staying with the little orphan. A quiet invitation for tomorrow. So as that small town and quiet road settle in your mind, you might notice a softer thought appearing at the edge of all this. You do not have to say goodbye to Cubone forever tonight. The story can sleep when you sleep, and then, if you feel drawn back to it, you can return in your own time, in your own way. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to do more thinking, but to imagine tiny, gentle tomorrows. Maybe another evening when you are rested and the world feels a little less heavy, you wander back into Lavender Town in a game, letting the simple music and pale colors wash over you as you walk past the tower again. Perhaps you scroll through Pokédex entries, noticing how different regions describe the same small Pokémon, or you simply daydream new scenes where Cubone's tears are met with a hand on its shoulder instead of silence. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and dreamers move at a slower pace. You can treat this as a quiet promise to your future self. There will be time for curiosity, for theories about what skull it wears, for comparing those ancient lines of text that mention its mother without naming her. There will be space for creativity, for wondering how people in different regions might have comforted a grieving Pokémon, but only when your body and mind feel ready again. For now, the only actions that matter are the smallest, most comforting ones. You might decide that on your next playthrough you will catch a Cubone and pause just a little longer on the naming screen, choosing something that feels like a blessing or a shelter. You might picture yourself as a kind trainer, kneeling down on some quiet route at dusk, offering it a safe home, a place where its bone is no longer a shield but a keepsake. To this day, the world of Pokémon is full of quiet stories like this, tucked between roots and myths, between Pokédex lines and forgotten NPC dialogue. Little pockets of emotion, waiting patiently for you to notice them. You do not have to seek them all at once. You can stroll through this ancient living world slowly, returning to old towns, old towers, and old questions whenever it feels gentle to do so. Tonight, though, there is nothing you need to hold on to. If any part of Cubone's story wants to stay, it will curl up in a corner of your memory on its own, and if it drifts away, that is just as okay. Even if your attention has ebbed and flowed, the mood of the story has still been working quietly, like nature smoothing the edges of a stone, creating a familiar, sheltered space in your mind where sleep can find you more easily. Tonight, we're drifting into the final part of this tale, a kind of lullaby where we return once more to Cubone and to your own breathing, slow and steady in the dark, because there is one more image, one more quiet revelation waiting just ahead, and it changes how we see that little skull forever. Good night, little Cubone, closing the story, opening the dream. So now, in this final stretch, let that last revelation soften and blur at the edges until it becomes only an image, quiet and small. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to one more scene. Somewhere far from towers and laboratories and Pokédex pages, Cubone has found a little hollow in the world. Maybe it is a shallow cave in a warm canyon wall, or a patch of grass beneath an ancient, twisted tree. The earth is cool, the air is gentle, and the sky above is a deep, patient blue-black. Cubone is curled up there, tucked in on itself the way a child might curl under a blanket. Its skull is tilted just a little to one side, no longer a question, no longer a mask it has to hold in place. Beside it, the worn bone it carries everywhere rests on the ground, not raised, not ready, simply lying there like a toy put down at the end of the day. Its breathing is slow and even, almost in rhythm with the faint movements of the night around it. In this moment, it is not crying. It is not listening for footsteps that will never come, not scanning the horizon for a shape it knows by heart. It is not haunted by entries or theories or the old Lavender Town myth. The world has grown very quiet, and that quiet holds it, the way the ocean holds a small stone at the bottom, perfectly still. Let that image draw a soft line back to your own body. Your head is resting, supported by pillow or mattress, as surely as Cubone's skull rests on the earth. Your breath moves in and out, steady and calm, like the slow rise and fall of a sleeping Pokemon's chest. Thoughts drift across your mind the way thin clouds slide across the face of the moon, here for a moment, then passing into the dark. Tonight we're drifting into a different kind of ending. You have walked through questions of origin and canon, through the spaces between what the games say and what they only suggest. You have passed by ancient towers and quiet graves, by fan myths and half-remembered sprites, and arrived here at something that does not need words, just a feeling of balance, of a story that can finally lie down and rest. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. The kindness you wished for Cubone you can offer inward now. You are allowed to be small in this vast world, allowed to be tired, allowed to simply close your eyes and let sleep find you without needing to solve every mystery first. It is all right if the details fade. To this day, the best stories are not the ones you can recite line by line, but the ones that wash over you and leave only a gentle impression, like a footprint in sand just before the tide returns, not to punish, but to reset the shore. So let this story do the same. Let Cubone curl deeper into its hollow. Let your own body grow heavier and quieter. Good night, little Cubone, wherever you are in this wide, ancient world. Good night to you, listening in the dark. From here, there are no more words you need to carry, only the quiet and the space where dreams begin.